Pity is a weapon of the weak to enslave the strong. Pity, in the modern world, is often seen as a moral virtuean, expression of empathy, solidarity, and compassion. But Friedrich Nietzsche offers a darker, far more subversive view. Pity is not a noble impulse. It is, in fact, a manipulative tool wielded by the weak to bring the strong down to their level. This idea forms a critical part of his master-slave morality distinction. Where the strong affirm life through action, power, and risk, the weak, those unable to assert dominance physically or intellectually, resort to moral frameworks that vilify strength and glorify suffering. In this moral inversion, the weak define themselves as good, not because of anything they do, but because they endure. They turn their powerlessness into moral superiority. The strong, meanwhile, are labeled as evil for doing what comes naturally to them, asserting will, shaping the world, competing, and thriving. Pity becomes the currency of control in this upside-down moral economy. It invites the powerful to feel shame for their strength and pride for their restraint. And in doing so, it tames them. Pity disarms. It appeals to the emotions of the strong by framing suffering as sacred and unchallengeable. The weak do not directly confront the strong, they cannot. Instead, they seduce them into a state of guilt. They coerce the strong into self-sacrifice, to pull back, to feel bad for winning. Under the banner of compassion, the powerful are taught to feel responsible for the pain of others. Slowly, they internalize the idea that their success is oppressive, their confidence is arrogance, and their ambition is cruelty. But Nietzsche warns, this is not moral enlightenment, it is psychological warfare. Modern institutions, religion, media, even education, often amplify this dynamic. Systems are built that reward victimhood narratives and suppress aggressive excellence. A person who suffers gains moral legitimacy, and a person who succeeds is suspected of unfairness. This dynamic can destroy civilizations from within, Nietzsche argues, because it cultivates weakness as a social ideal and punishes vitality. By branding pity as noble, society promotes a quiet tyranny of the mediocre. Those with no capacity to create, conquer, or lead instead create frameworks that enforce humility, modesty, and collective guilt. And the more the strong bow to this emotional pressure, the more power the weak acquire, not through merit, but through manipulation. This is not a call to cruelty. It is a call to vigilance. Compassion can coexist with strength, but when pity becomes the means of social control, it no longer uplifts, it enslaves. And those who fall for its trap may find themselves living not by their own will, but by the guilt designed for them by others who never intended to rise, only to pull others down. Morality is a social invention designed to control instincts. Morality, as it appears in every society, is not a divine truth handed down from the heavens. It is a social construct, built and refined by those in power to regulate human instincts, especially those deemed dangerous to the social order. This claim unravels the sanctity often attached to moral codes and reframes them as mechanisms of control. Instead of asking what is good or evil, the more penetrating question becomes, who benefits from this morality? Arthur Schopenhauer saw morality not as a transcendent guide, but as a necessary response to the chaotic nature of human will. Our instincts, sexual, aggressive, territorial, deeply animalistic. Left unchecked, they threaten the fabric of cooperative society. To survive in groups, human beings required structures that would limit the destructiveness of individual drives. Thus, morality was born. Not out of enlightenment, but necessity. It is the leash placed on desire, so that civilization could function. Nietzsche radicalizes this view. In his framework, morality is not only practical, it is political. The moral systems we internalize are expressions of the will to power. They are not neutral or fair. They are created by dominant forces, religions, ruling classes, ideological movements, program behavior. They define instincts as either good or evil, depending on whether those instincts serve or threaten the existing order. A warrior culture may moralize courage, dominance, and glory. A theocratic society might sanctify obedience, humility, and chastity. Morality shifts not with truth, but with control. This is why instincts like ambition, lust, aggression, and pride are often condemned. They are powerful, and power in the hands of the individual is a threat to collective systems. Morality transforms these forces into sins, not to improve the individual, but to neutralize them. People are conditioned to feel guilty not for doing wrong, but for acting outside the behavioral framework deemed acceptable by their time and place. Foucault extends this analysis into institutions. Schools, prisons, hospitals, and even families act as moralizing agents. They do not just discipline behavior, they shape identity. People are rewarded for being good, meaning compliant, and punished for being bad, meaning disruptive. These are not fixed truths, but flexible standards adjusted to serve those who benefit from order. As a result, individuals internalize surveillance. They begin to regulate themselves, believing they are being moral, when in fact, they are being obedient. Morality, then, is not about justice. It's about stability. It creates an artificial binary between base instincts and higher principles, when in reality, those instincts are natural forces. What is considered moral may simply be that which renders the human animal more docile. It does not elevate human nature, it suppresses it. This idea forces a confrontation with the systems we've accepted blindly. It challenges us to ask whether we are being ethical or merely conditioned. In doing so, it reframes morality not as a beacon, but as a boundary one, drawn to fence in what is most dangerously alive within us. Truth is not universalis manufactured by those in power. Truth, in its most comforting form, appears as something objective, eternal, and discoverable. But Michel Foucault shattered that illusion by revealing a disturbing alternative. Truth is not a neutral reality waiting to be uncovered. It is a social construction produced and enforced by those who control institutions, language, and discourse. Power does not simply repress truth, it creates it. Foucault's insight begins with a simple observation. Different societies across history have held radically different conceptions of what is true. What was once true in the Middle Ages, divine kingship, geocentrism, witchcraft is now regarded as falsehood. And yet, in their time, these ideas were not questioned, they were truths, protected by force, and widely internalized. How does this happen? Truth, Foucault argues, is not outside power, it is a function of power. It emerges from systems of knowledge, what he called regimes of truth, which determine what can be spoken, what is considered legitimate, and who has the authority to speak. Science, religion, media, education. These are not just sources of knowledge, they are engines of power that define what counts as reality. They frame the debate, control the terms, and exclude competing views. This means that truth is inherently political. It serves agendas. The truth about history, identity, race, gender, mental health, crime, and even reason itself is crafted within power structures. For example, colonial powers presented their dominance as a civilizing mission framing exploitation as progress. Mental illness has been defined in ways that often reflect more about social control than objective biology. Sexual norms are medicalized or demonized depending on who holds the cultural reins. The idea that truth is constructed does not mean that facts do not exist, but it does mean that which facts are emphasized, interpreted, and institutionalized is a matter of power. A government may bury inconvenient data while amplifying supportive narratives. A media outlet may give platform to certain experts while silencing others. The result is not elites, a truth manufactured to serve specific interests. Even science is not immune. Funding sources, institutional priorities, and ideological pressures shape what research is conducted, how it's interpreted, and how it's disseminated. The myth of objectivity masks the very human and very political process of knowledge production. Foucault called this the will to knowledge, an echo of Nietzsche's will to power. By recognizing this, we're forced to abandon the comfort of believing that truth is out there, untouched by human hands. Instead, we must learn to read truth as a battlefield. Competing truths are not just arguments, they are power plays. What wins out is not what is most accurate, but what is most enforceable. Schools teach it, courts uphold it, media repeats it, and the public eventually absorbs it. In this view, truth is not sacred, it is strategic. It is something to question, to trace, to deconstruct. For only by understanding who created a truth and why, can we begin to free ourselves from its grip. Compassion, at first glance, seems like the highest human virtue, an act of selfless love, an emotional response to the suffering of others. But Friedrich Nietzsche proposed a darker interpretation. That compassion is often not what it claims to be. Beneath its tender surface, it can conceal a deep resentment. This isn't the resentment of a person wronged by a specific act, it is a fundamental bitterness toward those who are powerful, successful, joyful, or simply untouched by suffering. Nietzsche called this emotional undercurrent resentment, a slow-burning poison of the weak and powerless directed at the strong. In this reading, compassion becomes less about helping others and more about dragging down those who are thriving. When someone pities another, especially repeatedly or condescendingly, they are not merely showing empathy, they are often affirming their own moral superiority. "I feel bad for you" can subtly morph into "I am better than you." Compassion becomes a means of reasserting a hierarchy, this time not through strength or dominance, but through virtue. Nietzsche believed that this dynamic was embedded in slave morality. In a world where the weak could not conquer the strong with weapons, they weaponized values. They reframed suffering, failure, and fragility as signs of moral greatness. The strong, in contrast, were demonized as cruel, heartless, or arrogant. Thus, compassion became the moral currency of the weak, a way to gain control over the strong by casting them as unfeeling oppressors. This resentment becomes especially visible in performative compassion, where acts of supposed kindness are broadcasted, exaggerated, or emotionally weaponized. The compassionate individual often uses the suffering of others as a mirror for their own moral exhibitionism. They may appear gentle on the surface, but internally, they carry the bitterness of someone who believes life has treated them unfairly. Their compassion isn't about healing, it's about attacking, disguised as helping. Michel Foucault might interpret this similarly through the lens of power dynamics. He would argue that compassion often maintains control structures. The one who gives compassion assumes a position of dominance, however subtly. They define the other as pitiful, broken, or in need of help, thus reinforcing their own position as morally or socially superior. Compassion, in this framework, is a form of soft control. Even in relationships, compassion can suffocate. When someone is perpetually cared for, pitied, or protected, they can lose autonomy. The giver of compassion may unconsciously resent the freedom or agency of the person they are helping. The act of helping then becomes a way to tame or reduce that person into something manageable, something less threatening. This philosophy challenges us to look deeply at our motivations. Do we feel compassion out of shared humanity, or because someone else's suffering makes us feel safer, purer, or more righteous? Compassion is not inherently bad, but when it's laced with resentment, it becomes a covert attack. And worse, it convinces both the giver and the receiver that it's an act of love. God is dead. With these words, Nietzsche did not declare victory for atheism. He sounded the alarm for a deep existential crisis. He wasn't referring to a literal deity's demise, but to the collapse of belief in a higher order, an absolute moral foundation, and a transcendent purpose. And he blamed not science or reason but human comfort and cowardice. Humanity killed God not by philosophical insight but by spiritual laziness. We preferred ease over struggle, certainty over meaning, and conformity over transcendence. Nietzsche's critique is aimed at modernity. As society advanced in science, economics, and technology, It slowly rendered the divine unnecessary, not through rebellion but through neglect. The divine was replaced by convenience, progress, and bureaucratic systems. Humans stopped striving toward something higher and instead settled into routines: jobs, entertainment, consumerism. Faith, once the fire of civilization, became a tradition with no heart-beat ritual for those too afraid to admit they no longer believed. Comfort deadens the soul. Nietzsche saw that once life became too easy, the will to power the drive to overcome, create, and transcend was replaced by a desire to be safe, agreeable, and undisturbed. In such a world, the heroic tension between man and the infinite disappears. God becomes irrelevant, not because he is disproven, but because no one bothers to seek him anymore. Cowardice plays an equally central role. Humanity didn't kill God with a sword but with silence. The modern man, Nietzsche argued, is too timid to live without absolutes. Instead of facing the chaos and responsibility of a godless world, people cling to shallow replacements, ideologies, political parties, therapeutic jargon, and consumer identities. These become their new sacred safe, predictable but spiritually hollow. Nietzsche warned of the consequences. Without God, old moral systems crumble. There is no longer an objective good or evil, only interpretation and will. This opens the door to nihilism, a state where nothing matters. And in the vacuum left by God, weak individuals often seek new masters, populist leaders, mass movements, or technocratic control systems. They trade one form of authority for another, because they cannot face the burden of meaning-making alone. To Nietzsche, the death of God was both a tragedy and an opportunity. It stripped away illusions, but also challenged humanity to become something greater, what he called the Übermensch. But this required courage. It demanded that people live without external validation or metaphysical guarantees. Most people, he believed, would fail this test. They would retreat into distractions, comforts, or herd morality. They would worship safety and call it virtue. Thus, the real murderers of God were not rebels or philosophers but ordinary people who chose mediocrity over meaning. In their fear of freedom, they buried the divine in paperwork, entertainment, and convenience. And now, they wander in a world of shattered values, still quoting the name of a God they no longer follow, too afraid to admit what they've done. Sex is commonly idealized as the ultimate act of intimacy and love, a moment of mutual vulnerability, connection, and pleasure. But Michel Foucault shattered this illusion with a more brutal assessment. Sex is not simply a private act between individuals, it is a site of power, surveillance, and control. Beneath the veneer of romance lies a battlefield where desire is shaped, regulated, and politicized by institutions, norms, and histories of domination. Foucault didn't argue that sex lacks emotion. Rather, he insisted that our understanding of sexuality is constructed by discourse systems of knowledge and language that dictate what is considered normal, healthy, perverse, or shameful. These definitions don't arise from love, they emerge from power structures. The church, the medical establishment, the law, education systems all have historically controlled how sex is discussed, practiced, and even imagined. This makes sex deeply political. When one person controls the terms of desire, who can express it, when and how they gain authority over another. That authority may be overt, as in legal systems regulating marriage, prostitution, and reproduction. Or it may be subtle, embedded in language, fashion, religion, and shame. The act itself becomes a performance within a socially constructed script. Who initiates, who consents, who withholds, all of it operates within layers of coded expectations. Sex also mirrors power dynamics in personal relationships. Dominance, submission, validation, and control all play out through physical intimacy. Sometimes these roles are negotiated consciously, but often they are reenacted unconsciously, shaped by internalized norms. One partner may use sex to manipulate, to reward, to punish, or to bind the other into emotional dependency. Even withholding sex can be an act of control. Moreover, societal narratives around sex are steeped in control-based thinking. Virginity is treated as property, infidelity as betrayal of ownership, and sexual availability as a measure of worth. Women historically have been sexualized and then praised for chastity, shamed for desire. Men have been pressured into conquest, measured by performance and dominance. These frameworks reduce sex to a tool of validation, not intimacy. Foucault also emphasized that as societies claim to liberate sexuality through secularism, medical discourse, or progressive values, they didn't eliminate control, they simply changed its form. Sex was no longer governed by religion, but by psychology, legislation, and data. New norms were built: what counts as healthy sex, what qualifies as trauma, what preferences are acceptable. Liberation, paradoxically, became another way to monitor. The battlefield metaphor becomes most visible in identity politics and sexual activism. The fight for rights of LGBTQ+ individuals, women, or marginalized groups is not just about pleasure or equality. It's a fight to reclaim sexual agency from centuries of institutional control. But even in activism, power games persist. Who gets visibility? Who sets the narrative? Whose sexuality is still exoticized or pathologized? Sex is never just sex. It's a mirror of civilization's deepest structures of hierarchy and influence. And love, genuine, mutual, transcendent love, must navigate this minefield. Until we understand the forces shaping our desires, we may never know whether we're making love or playing roles in a war we didn't choose. Pity, in the modern world, is often seen as a moral Virtuean expression of empathy, solidarity, and compassion. But Friedrich Nietzsche offers a darker, far more subversive view. Pity is not a noble impulse. It is, in fact, a manipulative tool wielded by the weak to bring the strong down to their level. This idea forms a critical part of his master-slave morality distinction. Where the strong affirm life through action, power, and risk, the weak, those unable to assert dominance physically or intellectually, resort to moral frameworks that vilify strength and glorify suffering. In this moral inversion, the weak define themselves as good, not because of anything they do, but because they endure. They turn their powerlessness into moral superiority. The strong, meanwhile, are labeled as evil for doing what comes naturally to them, asserting will, shaping the world, competing, and thriving. Pity becomes the currency of control in this upside-down moral economy. It invites the powerful to feel shame for their strength and pride for their restraint, and in doing so, it tames them. Pity disarms. It appeals to the emotions of the strong by framing suffering as sacred and unchallengeable. The weak do not directly confront the strong, they cannot. Instead, they seduce them into a state of guilt. They coerce the strong into self-sacrifice, to pull back, to feel bad for winning. Under the banner of compassion, the powerful are taught to feel responsible for the pain of others. Slowly, they internalize the idea that their success is oppressive, their confidence is arrogance, and their ambition is cruelty. But Nietzsche warns, this is not moral enlightenment, it is psychological warfare. Modern institutions, religion, media, even education, often amplify this dynamic. Systems are built that reward victimhood narratives and suppress aggressive excellence. A person who suffers gains moral legitimacy, and a person who succeeds is suspected of unfairness. This dynamic can destroy civilizations from within, Nietzsche argues, because it cultivates weakness as a social ideal and punishes vitality. By branding pity as noble, society promotes a quiet tyranny of the mediocre. Those with no capacity to create, conquer, or lead instead create frameworks that enforce humility, modesty, and collective guilt. And the more the strong bow to this emotional pressure, the more power the weak acquire, not through merit, but through manipulation. This is not a call to cruelty. It is a call to vigilance. Compassion can coexist with strength. But when pity becomes the means of social control, it no longer uplifts, it enslaves. And those who fall for its trap may find themselves living not by their own will, but but by the guilt designed for them by others who never intended to rise, only to pull others down. Morality, as it appears in every society, is not a divine truth handed down from the heavens. It is a social construct, built and refined by those in power to regulate human instincts, especially those deemed dangerous to the social order. This claim unravels the sanctity often attached to moral codes and reframes them as mechanisms of control. Instead of asking what is good or evil, the more penetrating question becomes, who benefits from this morality? Arthur Schopenhauer saw morality not as a transcendent guide but as a necessary response to the chaotic nature of human will. Our instincts, sexual, aggressive, territorial, are deeply animalistic. Left unchecked, they threaten the fabric of cooperative society. To survive in groups, human beings required structures that would limit the destructiveness of individual drives. Thus, morality was born, not out of enlightenment, but necessity. It is the leash placed on desire so that civilization could function. Nietzsche radicalizes this view. In his framework, morality is not only practical, it is political. The moral systems we internalize are expressions of the will to power. They are not neutral or fair. They are created by dominant forces, religions, ruling classes, ideological movements to program behavior. They define instincts as either good or evil, depending on whether those instincts serve or threaten the existing order. A warrior culture may moralize courage, dominance, and glory. A theocratic society might sanctify obedience, humility, and chastity. Morality shifts not with truth, but with control. This is why instincts like ambition, lust, aggression, and pride are often condemned. They are powerful, and power in the hands of the individual is a threat to collective systems. Morality transforms these forces into sins, not to improve the individual, but to neutralize them. People are conditioned to feel guilty not for doing wrong, but for acting outside the behavioral framework deemed acceptable by their time and place. Foucault extends this analysis into institutions. Schools, prisons, hospitals, and even families act as moralizing agents. They do not just discipline behavior, they shape identity. People are rewarded for being good, meaning compliant, and punished for being bad, meaning disruptive. These are not fixed truths, but flexible standards adjusted to serve those who benefit from order. As a result, individuals internalize surveillance. They begin to regulate themselves, believing they are being moral, when in fact they are being obedient. Morality, then, is not about justice. It's about stability. It creates an artificial binary between base instincts and higher principles, when in reality, those instincts are natural forces. What is considered moral may simply be that which renders the human animal more docile. It does not elevate human nature, it suppresses it. This idea forces a confrontation with the systems we've accepted blindly. It challenges us to ask whether we are being ethical or merely conditioned. In doing so, it reframes morality not as a beacon, but as a boundary one drawn to fence in what is most dangerously alive within us. Truth, in its most comforting form, appears as something objective, eternal, and discoverable. But Michel Foucault shattered that illusion by revealing a disturbing alternative. Truth is not a neutral reality waiting to be uncovered. It is a social construction produced and enforced by those who control institutions, language, and discourse. Power does not simply repress truth, it creates it. Foucault's insight begins with a simple observation. Different societies across history have held radically different conceptions of what is true. What was once true in the Middle Ages, divine kingship, geocentrism, witchcraft, is now regarded as falsehood. And yet, in their time, these ideas were not questioned, they were truths, protected by force, and widely internalized. How does this happen? Truth, Foucault argues, is not outside power, it is a function of power. It emerges from systems of knowledge, what he called regimes of truth, which determine what can be spoken, what is considered legitimate, and who has the authority to speak. Science, religion, media, education. These are not just sources of knowledge. They are engines of power that define what counts as reality. They frame the debate, control the terms, and exclude competing views. This means that truth is inherently political. It serves agendas. The truth about history, identity, race, gender, mental health, crime, and even reason itself is crafted within power structures. For example, colonial powers presented their dominance as a civilizing mission framing exploitation as progress. Mental illness has been defined in ways that often reflect more about social control than objective biology. Sexual norms are medicalized or demonized, depending on who holds the cultural reins. The idea that truth is constructed does not mean that facts do not exist, but it does mean that which facts are emphasized, interpreted, and institutionalized is a matter of power. A government may bury inconvenient data while amplifying supportive narratives. A media outlet may give platform to certain experts while silencing others. The result is not elites, a truth manufactured to serve specific interests. Even science is not immune. Funding sources, institutional priorities, and ideological pressures shape what research is conducted, how it's interpreted, and how it's disseminated. The myth of objectivity masks the very human and very political process of knowledge production. Foucault called this the will to knowledge, an echo of Nietzsche's will to power. By recognizing this, we're forced to abandon the comfort of believing that truth is out there, untouched by human hands. Instead, we must learn to read truth as a battlefield. Competing truths are not just arguments, they are power plays. What wins out is not what is most accurate, but what is most enforceable. Schools teach it, courts uphold it, media repeats it, and the public eventually absorbs it. In this view, truth is not sacred, it is strategic. It is something to question, to trace, to deconstruct. For only by understanding who created a truth and why, can we begin to free ourselves from its grip. People desire to be dominated, it gives them identity. At first glance, this statement appears paradoxical. We live in a society obsessed with freedom, autonomy, and self-expression. People proclaim their independence, defend their rights, and speak of individualism with near-religious fervor. But beneath the surface lies a different psychological truth. Many people yearn to be dominated. Not because they are weak in some crude physical sense, but because domination provides structure, clarity, and identity. Freedom is terrifying. It demands constant decision-making, responsibility, and the risk of failure. In contrast, being dominated offers a psychological safety net. It allows individuals to outsource the burden of choice. Michel Foucault explored this dynamic in his work on power. He argued that domination is not merely imposed from above, it is often invited, accepted, even desired. Systems of power function best when they are internalized. People willingly conform to hierarchies, disciplines, and authority figures because it helps define who they are. A role in a system is easier to manage than absolute freedom. It tells you what is right, what is wrong, what your duties are, and most importantly, who you are. The dominated person receives a clear place in the social order. Identity is no longer an existential riddle, it's a role to perform. Nietzsche took this even further. He saw the desire for domination as tied to a deeper resentment. Those who lack the will or strength to assert their own values will instead adopt the values of others. They submit not because they must, but because it shields them from the terrifying task of self-creation. For Nietzsche, the average person avoids freedom. He or she doesn't want to forge their own path, they want to follow a shepherd, wear a uniform, join a cause, or serve a leader. The dominated life provides a kind of moral laziness, a relief from the need to ask difficult questions. This is evident in religious structures, political movements, corporate hierarchies, and even in romantic relationships. People often surrender to dogma, charismatic leaders, or ideological systems because it gives them identity. The believer, the patriot, the good employee, the faithful spouse. These are identities granted by submission to an external code. And once internalized, this code becomes inseparable from the self. People then defend the very systems that dominate them, sometimes violently, because their sense of self is now entangled with their obedience. The darker implication is that freedom may not be the highest human need. The need for identity, stability, and belonging may surpass it. When given the choice between chaotic freedom and structured domination, many choose the latter. This isn't just a political fact, it's a psychological one. Domination offers certainty in a world that is otherwise full of ambiguity. It tells people what to believe, how to act, and where they fit. And once that is in place, people will fight to maintain it not just out of fear, but out of comfort. To be dominated is, for many, not a loss but a form of relief. Your values were implanted into you by people you'll never meet. Most people like to believe that their values are self-chosen, that they are the product of personal reflection, upbringing, or conscious decision-making. But this belief collapses under scrutiny. Our moral compass, our beliefs about right and wrong, success and failure, love and hate, are largely inherited not by family alone, but by unseen institutions, forgotten teachers, and faceless systems. The values we hold sacred were often implanted in us before we were even capable of questioning them. From birth, human beings are subjected to social conditioning. Families pass down customs without explaining their origin. Schools enforce rules of conduct that reflect broader cultural assumptions. Media shapes perceptions of beauty, success, and justice, long before a child can critically engage with those narratives. Even the language we use, how we define ourselves, what we consider normal, is loaded with inherited assumptions. These values are not chosen, they are absorbed. Michel Foucault would argue that our very subjectivity is formed through these processes. Identity is not discovered, it is constructed by the intersection of discourses, institutions, and historical forces. For example, a person may value hard work not because of any intrinsic insight, but because capitalism rewards and praises labor discipline. Another may champion tolerance, not from deep reflection, but because liberal democracy positions tolerance as a moral good. Both believe they chose these values. In reality, they inherited them from cultural systems designed to reproduce themselves. Nietzsche, too, understood this. He saw traditional morality, especially Christian morality, as the invention of the weak to constrain the strong. Over centuries, this moral structure embedded itself so deeply into the Western psyche that people began to think of it as natural. But for Nietzsche, it was an invention with a specific agenda. To follow inherited values blindly is to live someone else's life. It is to wear a costume without knowing who designed it or why. Even the most rebellious ideologies are often contaminated with inherited frameworks. Modern political and ethical movements often position themselves as radical alternatives, yet they continue to use the same moral vocabulary given to them by the systems they oppose. Concepts like justice, equality, or rights may feel intuitive, but they are historical constructs shaped by legal traditions, religious doctrines, and economic systems. They did not emerge from a vacuum, they were forged, refined, and transmitted by generations we'll never meet. This creates a profound existential challenge. How can one live authentically if their deepest values are echoes of someone else's ideas? The answer isn't to erase all inherited values, it's impossible, but to interrogate them. To examine where they came from, who benefits from them, and whether they serve one's highest potential or merely keep one domesticated. The illusion of autonomous value creation is comforting. But if we're honest, we must admit that much of what we believe is not the product of freedom, but of repetition. Our convictions are scripts handed down by the dead, reinforced by institutions, and rarely questioned by the living. The pursuit of knowledge is often just another way to exert control. We tend to glorify the pursuit of knowledge as a noble endeavor, something pure, objective, and progressive. But Michel Foucault shattered that illusion by revealing knowledge as inseparable from power. To know is to categorize, to observe, to define, and to define something is to control it. The history of knowledge, then, is not just a history of enlightenment, but of surveillance, domination, and ideological conquest. Knowledge, far from being neutral, is deeply embedded in the structures that produce it. From the moment societies began classifying people by race, gender, intelligence, sexuality, criminality, knowledge ceased to be an impartial tool. It became a method for social control. Institutions like prisons, schools, hospitals, and military academies are not just places where knowledge is applied, they are places where it is created, refined, and used to shape behavior. The so-called truths discovered within them often serve the needs of the state or dominant class. What is pathological and what is normal, what is gifted and what is deficient, these labels are not neutral observations. They are judgments that determine how individuals are treated, valued, or punished. Foucault introduced the concept of power, knowledge, to describe this relationship. Power does not simply use knowledge as a tool, it generates it. Every regime of power produces its own truths, its own sciences, its own moral justifications. Colonial empires produced ethnographic studies to justify their domination. Industrial states produced psychological models to mold ideal workers. Modern governments deploy statistical knowledge to manage populations. These aren't abstract curiosities, they are systems of control masquerading as insight. Even scientific inquiry, long believed to be above politics, is subject to this logic. Research priorities are often set by funding bodies aligned with corporate or political interests. What gets studied, what gets ignored, and how findings are interpreted are deeply influenced by external power structures. Scientific truths are shaped by what society is ready or willing to accept. Galileo's heliocentrism was not dangerous because it was false, but because it challenged the power of the Church. This doesn't mean that all knowledge is corrupt or useless, but it does mean that the pursuit of knowledge is never innocent. It always has a context, a motive, a direction. To study something is to render it legible, observable, and therefore governable. Bureaucracies run on knowledge. Empires expand by mapping terrain. Modern capitalism depends on consumer data. Every inch of gained knowledge often results in new tools for discipline. The act of knowing can also be an act of domination over others. To study a group, whether in anthropology, psychology, or histories, to place them under scrutiny, often without consent, and to define them through lenses they did not choose. Knowledge becomes a mirror held up by the powerful to reflect back what they need to see. To seek knowledge is not wrong. But we must ask, knowledge for what? And for whom? When we fail to interrogate the power dynamics behind inquiry, we risk becoming complicit in systems that use truth, not to liberate, but to govern. Happiness is a lie sold by marketers and priests. The modern obsession with happiness is not a product of enlightenment or psychological evolution. It is a manufactured ideal, sold to us through centuries of religious doctrine and refined by capitalist marketing into a product, a destination, a moral imperative. The concept of happiness, as it is commonly sold today, is neither attainable nor honest. It functions primarily as a tool of control, encouraging conformity, suppressing critical thought, and maintaining obedience to systems that benefit from people remaining content with shallow rewards. Religious traditions, particularly in the West, have long defined happiness in moralistic terms. Christianity, for instance, teaches that true happiness lies in submission to God's will, in humility, chastity, and self-denial. These ideals do not arise from a neutral observation of human flourishing. They serve the needs of institutional power. By teaching people to equate happiness with piety, obedience, and faith, religious leaders establish a framework where deviation from doctrine is seen not only as sin, but as a personal failure to be truly joyful. As Nietzsche warned, this moralized happiness weakens the spirit. It asks individuals not to pursue greatness, struggle, or authentic desire, but to become meek, modest, and forgiving. These traits are not celebrated because they are naturally good, they are celebrated because they make people easier to control. The idea that suffering has redemptive meaning, that pain is a divine test, is not a spiritual truth. It is a coping mechanism offered by institutions that cannot or will not relieve that suffering. Enter the marketer. In the secular age, the priest has been replaced by the advertiser. But the message is largely the same. You are incomplete, and only by following our path can you become whole. The difference is that now, salvation is not eternal, it is material. Happiness is rebranded as consumption, lifestyle, and image. You are told that with the right car, skin cream, social media following, or diet plan, you will finally be happy. But like religious salvation, this kind of happiness is always just out of reach, intentionally so. If happiness were truly attainable, the economy would collapse. Capitalism thrives on dissatisfaction. The dream of happiness must remain unfulfilled so that people continue to buy, subscribe, and aspire. Marketers do not sell products, they sell the emotional illusion that happiness can be purchased. They weaponize psychology to manipulate desires, equate pleasure with meaning, and distract people from deeper existential questions. The tragic irony is that the pursuit of this marketed happiness often leads to profound unhappiness. People blame themselves for not feeling fulfilled, despite having checked all the boxes society told them would lead to joy. They work jobs they hate, maintain appearances they can't afford, and chase goals that aren't their own for the promise of a happiness that never arrives. In truth, the system is not broken. It is working exactly as designed. Happiness, in its marketed form, is not a goal, it is bait. A carefully constructed fantasy designed to keep people docile, consuming, and chasing a mirage. Real meaning may lie elsewhere in struggle, creation, rebellion, but that kind of fulfillment cannot be sold, and so it is systematically hidden. Most people would rather be lied to than challenged. Confronting reality is an act of violence against the comfortable illusions most people spend their lives cultivating. The average person does not seek truth, they seek reassurance. And when the two come into conflict, most will choose the lie that protects their worldview over the truth that shatters it. This is not a sign of weakness in the intellectual sense, it is a survival mechanism. The human mind craves coherence, stability, and affirmation. Challenging beliefs threatens the fragile scaffolding of identity, and so lies become not just tolerated but preferred. The social contract is built on shared delusions. People pretend to believe in things they don't fully understand. Democracy, justice, meritocracy, love, and demand that others do the same. To challenge these ideals is to become an outcast. Truth-tellers are rarely embraced in society. They are mocked, marginalized, or erased. Why? Because they remind others of what they already suspect but refuse to admit, that life is more chaotic, more unfair, and more uncontrollable than they are willing to accept. Friedrich Nietzsche observed that human beings are not driven by a will to truth, but by a will to avoid pain. Lies are anesthetic. They soothe the dissonance between what we want to be true and what is. People will construct elaborate belief systems to defend against reality. They will follow ideologies, join cults, adhere to dogmas not out of deep understanding, but out of a desire to avoid the abyss of uncertainty. This phenomenon is evident in politics, religion, media, and personal relationships. Voters will ignore facts to maintain party loyalty. Believers will dismiss contradictions in sacred texts to preserve faith. Spouses will pretend not to notice infidelities because acknowledging them would implode the illusion of harmony. In all cases, the lie is preferable to the pain of change. Even education, which is supposedly about challenging ideas, often becomes a delivery system for comforting narratives. Schools rarely encourage students to think critically about the foundations of their society. Instead, they are taught to memorize and repeat. Questioning the system is discouraged not because the system is secure, but because it is fragile. Institutions survive by perpetuating myths, and those myths must be protected from inquiry. Most damningly, people lie to themselves. They lie about their motivations, their values, their happiness. They pretend to love jobs they hate, maintain friendships that drain them, and pursue goals they never chose. This self-deception is often unconscious, but it is no less manipulative. It allows people to function in a world that does not reward authenticity. The truth is rarely comfortable. It is often ugly, destabilizing, and lonely. And so people retreat into echo chambers, follow charismatic leaders, and curate lives built on half-truths. They don't want to be awakened, they want to be comforted. The matrix of lies we live in isn't imposed from above, it is generated from within. People prefer a beautiful illusion over a painful reality. And anyone who insists on telling the truth is often labeled not as courageous, but as cruel. Your individuality is a curated myth. The idea of individuality is one of the most sacred tenets of modern identity. We are taught from a young age that we are unique, original, free-thinking beings. That our tastes, choices, beliefs, and behaviors emerge from within, not from without. But this notion is largely an illusion. Individuality, in the way it is commonly understood, is not an innate essence, it is a curated performance. A social construct, assembled from fragments of media, culture, upbringing, and peer influence, designed to feel authentic while ensuring conformity within acceptable bounds. From fashion to politics, from sexuality to career ambition, what we think of as personal choice is often the result of subtle external shaping. We are told we have options, but we rarely examine where those options come from. Michel Foucault would argue that society does not merely repress individuals, it produces them. Institutions, norms, and discourses create the conditions for identity to form. You are not a sovereign individual discovering your truth. You are the product of systems deciding what truths are available for you to adopt. Social media amplifies this curation to a grotesque degree. People build identities through algorithms selecting aesthetics, values, and language that align with specific tribes or subcultures. Every post, every opinion, every outfit becomes a signal, not of individuality, but of affiliation. Authenticity is performed through borrowed content, filtered self-images, and trending ideologies. Even rebellion has its own uniform. Nonconformity becomes just another brand. What is sold as self-expression is often a narrow lane of pre-approved personality types. Are you the wellness guru? The edgy intellectual? The activist entrepreneur? These archetypes are pre-packaged and sold back to us by media, advertising, and cultural gatekeepers. You don't discover your individuality, you subscribe to it. And you're rewarded for it with likes, approval, and inclusion. Nietzsche would call this the herd instinct. People fear being truly alone, so they manufacture a version of themselves that fits just far enough outside the center to feel distinct, but close enough to still be accepted. The masses don't crave originality, they crave distinction within limits. The myth of individuality provides this. It flatters the ego while keeping the social order intact. Even the inner self, the part we think is untouched by outside influences, shaped by language, memory, and trauma. Your desires are conditioned. Your fears are inherited. Your values are implanted. And yet, you believe these things are yours. This is the genius of the curated myth. It feels real, it feels earned, but it is assembled like a collage from fragments that were never yours to begin with. To admit that individuality is a construct is not to deny the self entirely, but to recognize its vulnerability. The ego is porous. Identity is malleable. What we call me is a narrative stitched together by forces far beyond our control. And unless we begin to unweave that fabric deliberately, we'll mistake the costume for our skin. Every act of kindness masks an unconscious desire to feel superior. Kindness is almost universally praised. It is treated as evidence of moral development, empathy, and altruism. But what if this cherished virtue conceals something darker, an unconscious desire to assert superiority? Nietzsche's psychological lens tears away the comforting story we tell ourselves about goodness, and instead asks us to confront the possibility that kindness often serves the ego more than the other. In this view, acts of charity, compassion, and moral generosity are not as selfless as they appear. They are performances of moral power. When a person gives to someone in need, there is a subtle shift in hierarchy. The giver becomes elevated, the receiver diminished. One holds the position of abundance, whether material, emotional, or moral, and the other occupies a space of lack. This exchange may be veiled in compassion, but it still reinforces roles. The powerful helper and the grateful helped. The more visible or public the act, the more it serves the identity of the one giving. It becomes less about aid and more about affirmation. This dynamic is amplified by social structures that reward displays of kindness. Public figures, corporations, and institutions showcase their charitable actions as proof of their goodness. But these acts are rarely separated from branding, status, or influence. The feel-good gesture becomes currency. Philanthropy becomes a strategic move. Even small-scale, personal kindness, helping a friend, comforting a stranger can be driven by an unconscious need to feel morally superior. There is also a psychological payoff. Kindness allows individuals to experience themselves as virtuous. The act of giving, forgiving, or comforting reinforces their identity as a good person. This self-perception becomes addictive. People may seek out opportunities to be kind not solely for the other's benefit, but for the internal reward. It's a form of self-serving virtue, quiet, subtle, and deeply embedded. Schopenhauer might argue that our will to life constantly seeks elevation, and kindness is just another strategy. Compassion becomes a way to dominate without appearing aggressive. It grants the illusion of benevolence while securing emotional leverage. For example, the person who always helps others may secretly hold expectations of gratitude, loyalty, or admiration. When these are not returned, resentment often follows, exposing the transactional nature behind the supposed selflessness. Foucault would likely point out how institutional kindness operates as a form of control. The welfare state, humanitarian aid, and even rehabilitation programs create dependencies and define identities. The recipient is labeled as in need, at risk, or underprivileged, and those labels follow them long after the act of kindness has passed. The giver, meanwhile, remains untarnished, elevated by their participation in benevolent systems that reinforce structural inequality while masking it in moral language. This is not to argue that kindness should be abolished, but that it must be examined. The truly ethical act may be the one done in silence, without recognition, without the expectation of moral reward. Anything else, no matter how benevolent it appears, risks becoming an act of disguised superiority, a way for the ego to flex under the guise of humility. There are no facts, only interpretations. This Nietzschean statement is one of the most provocative in the history of philosophy. It doesn't deny the existence of reality, it denies the idea that reality is ever encountered in a pure, unfiltered way. What we call facts are always wrapped in language, context, perspective, and intention. They are mediated by human consciousness, shaped by historical forces, and used in service of narratives. There is no objective truth standing outside interpretation. Every fact is already a perspective dressed in authority. Take history, for example. Every account of the past is a selection, a construction of meaning through choices about what to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize. A battle may be described as a glorious victory, a brutal massacre, or a tragic misunderstanding, depending on who is telling the story and why. The raw data, the number of dead, the date, the location might be agreed upon, but the meaning of those facts is never neutral. The truth of an event is always interpretive. Science, often held up as the realm of objective fact, is not immune. Scientific findings emerge from hypotheses that are themselves shaped by paradigms, funding structures, and cultural interests. Data does not speak for itself. It is collected, framed, and analyzed through interpretive lenses. A medical study showing a statistical correlation does not prove causality, yet such findings are often treated as gospel in public discourse. What we call facts are often conclusions derived through theoretical models that may one day be revised or overturned. Even simple sensory experience is subject to interpretation. Two people can witness the same event and walk away with entirely different understandings of what occurred. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Perception is filtered through expectation, emotion, and prior knowledge. What one person experiences as a fact, another may dismiss as illusion. There is no pure access to what is, only a human mind trying to make sense of it. Foucault took this idea further, arguing that what counts as a fact in a society is determined by those in power. Truth is not merely discovered, it is produced through institutions like schools, media, law, and science. These institutions set the standards for what is considered valid knowledge. Competing interpretations are dismissed not because they are false, but because they threaten the dominant discourse. Thus, facts are never free of politics. They are constructed within regimes of truth that serve particular social functions. This is not a call to abandon reason or descend into chaos. Rather, it is a demand for humility. It asks us to recognize that our convictions, no matter how data-driven or rational, are always embedded in interpretive frameworks. To acknowledge this is not to retreat from truth, but to engage with it more honestly. The fact is not a final answer. It is a beginning, a signal that we must ask, whose fact is this? Who benefits from its acceptance? And what alternative interpretations have been silenced? In the end, to say there are no facts, only interpretations, is not an abandonment of meaning. It's a refusal to pretend that meaning is ever simple. People crave systems of thought because they fear freedom. Freedom is terrifying. Not the political kind, but the existential kind. The kind that strips away every excuse, every crutch, every external authority. It is the condition of being entirely responsible for one's thoughts, actions, and meaning. Most people say they want this kind of freedom, but what they really want is security disguised as autonomy. Systems of thought, religions, ideologies, philosophies offer a structure in which to exist. They reduce the chaos of reality into categories, rules, and narratives. And in doing so, they offer relief from the paralyzing burden of total freedom. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this well. He saw most philosophies and moral codes as disguises for fear. People adopt systems not because they are true, but because they offer protection from the abyss. The chaos of a godless, meaningless universe is too much for the average person to confront directly. So instead, they accept structures that tell them what to value, how to behave, and who to be. These systems give them a script, and following that script allows them to avoid the agony of existential choice. Michel Foucault would say that systems of thought are also tools of power. They don't just provide meaning, they impose norms. They create disciplines. The individual is not liberated by systems, but produced by them. A capitalist system creates the entrepreneur. A religious system creates the believer. An academic system creates the scholar. These are not neutral identities. They are modes of control, internalized by individuals who believe they are acting freely. In reality, they are operating within tightly defined conceptual boundaries. The irony is that systems of thought often promise freedom as their selling point. Religious salvation, political revolution, self-help doctrines, they all market themselves as paths to liberation. But what they actually deliver is a new form of structure. The believer feels free because they are saved, but in reality, they are following rules handed down from above. The revolutionary feels free because they have broken from tradition, but they quickly adopt new dogmas and taboos. The self-help reader feels empowered, but they are often just replacing one dependency with another. Why is this pattern so persistent? Because freedom, in its pure form, is brutally demanding. It requires individuals to construct their own values, navigate uncertainty without guarantee, and take full ownership of failure. It means rejecting the comfort of groupthink and walking alone through intellectual and moral wilderness. Very few people are willing to pay that price. It's easier to outsource one's freedom to a system to exchange it for coherence, community, and certainty. Systems of thought are not inherently bad. They can offer insight, connection, and even beauty. But they become dangerous when mistaken for truth. When people believe their system is not one of many lenses, but the only possible view, they become ideological captives. The real danger is not that people live without freedom, it's that they think they're free because they follow a system that tells them they are. To truly be free, one must be willing to walk without a map. Most people, faced with that choice, will choose the comfort of a cage over the terror of the open field. Good and evil, our labelspower, decides which is which. The concepts of good and evil are treated as timeless, universal truths. They are invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, pulpits, and political campaigns as if they were fixed coordinates in a moral universe. But this belief is a dangerous illusion. Good and evil are not absolute. They are linguistic weapons, strategically deployed to elevate one side and demonize the other. The determining factor is not divine decree or universal morality. It is power. Those who hold power dictate what is virtuous and what is vile, often retroactively and always in their favor. Nietzsche dissected this with surgical precision in his critique of morality. He argued that moral values are not discovered, they are created. The so-called good emerged historically from the dominant class nobility, warriors, rulers who associated goodness with strength, nobility, beauty, and self-affirmation. Evil, in contrast, was a label created later by the powerless, who resented the traits of their oppressors. In this slave morality, weakness, humility, and suffering were elevated as moral ideals, not out of enlightenment, but as a psychological counterattack. This reframing of good and evil was not moral progression, was a reversal driven by resentment. Power didn't vanish, it just changed hands, or at least changed forms. The new morality wasn't more truant, was more effective for those who needed to invert the moral hierarchy. This exposes a disturbing truth. Morality is not about truth, it's about usefulness. It serves the interests of whoever can enforce their version of the moral order. Michel Foucault expanded this idea into the modern world by examining how institutions define morality. Schools, governments, courts, and psychiatric hospitals determine who is sane, who is deviant, who is criminal, who is honorable. These categories change across time and geography not because morality evolves toward truth, but because different power structures rise and fall. One generation's heretic becomes the next generation's prophet. What was once criminal becomes normalized, even celebrated. What was once virtuous becomes repressive. This doesn't mean that good and evil are meaningless, but that they are context-dependent. A war hero in one culture is a war criminal in another. A religious martyr in one narrative is a terrorist in another. The content of moral language shifts depending on who is writing the history books. Control the narrative, and you control the moral lens through which the world is seen. Modern media illustrates this perfectly. With enough repetition, framing, and emotional manipulation, a group or individual can be branded evil despite ambiguity, or sanctified despite guilt. Morality becomes marketing, justice becomes branding, and the public, eager for simplicity, accepts these judgments without question. When power decides morality, the question is no longer what is right, but who benefits from calling this right? To live morally, then, is not to blindly obey the prevailing code, but to interrogate it, to ask who authored it, why it exists, and whether it serves truth or simply power dressed in moral clothing. Human history is a history of domination. Beneath the surface of human civilization, its empires, religions, revolutions, and institutions lies a brutal and consistent theme: domination. From ancient tribal conquests to digital surveillance capitalism, history is less a story of moral progress and more a chronicle of who controlled whom. The tools of domination have evolved. Swords became laws, chains became debt, and thrones became bureaucracies. But the core dynamic remains: one group asserting control over another. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this plainly. He rejected the idea that history bends toward justice or reason. Instead, he viewed it as the continuous exercise of the will to power, the primal drive to expand, control, and assert one's force upon the world. Whether through conquest, legislation, theology, or ideology, the central pursuit has always been the same: subjugate others to your values, your needs, your vision of order. Michel Foucault echoed this sentiment in his analysis of modern institutions. He argued that domination did not disappear. With the decline of monarchies, it became more subtle, more systemic. Power no longer needed to manifest as a king's decree. It flowed through institutions like schools, hospitals, and prisons, shaping behavior through classification, normalization, and surveillance. Disciplinary power replaced brute force. But the goal remained: maintain control over populations. Look at the history of religion, often portrayed as the moral backbone of society. Behind its teachings of love and peace lies a deep machinery of control. From inquisitions to excommunications, from divine right to moral policing, religious systems have long dictated what people may believe, whom they may marry, how they may live, and die, all justified by supposed divine authority. Religion has not merely guided souls, it has ruled bodies and minds. Colonialism offers another example. Under the guise of civilization, Western powers subjugated entire continents, erasing cultures, exploiting resources, and enforcing foreign rule. The language of progress masked an economy of extraction. History books in colonizing nations often omit the brutality and celebrate the achievements, revealing again how narratives of domination are sanitized for the benefit of the victors. In the modern era, domination has not vanished, it has been corporatized. Global markets dictate labor conditions, advertising hijacks desire, and technology companies monitor behavior with terrifying precision. The freedom of the consumer masks a new form of servitude, driven not by kings or generals, but algorithms and credit scores. Human history is not a linear march toward enlightenment. It is a loop of control, resistance, and rebranded domination. Each age invents its own tools and justifications, but the underlying instinct persists. Even revolutions, born in the name of liberation, often replace one ruling class with another. Liberation movements become governments. Outsiders become gatekeepers. The honest reading of history is not cynical, it is realistic. To understand the past, we must stop pretending that it was guided by justice and begin to see it for what it was: a long, complex struggle to dominate and avoid being dominated. Progress is possible, but only if we stop confusing it with the mere evolution of control. The oppressed often dream not of justice, but of becoming the oppressor. There is a comforting narrative that oppressed people yearn solely for equality, dignity, and freedom. This story casts the downtrodden as morally pure, seeking only to right the wrongs of history. But history tells a more uncomfortable truth. Often, the oppressed do not seek justice, they seek reversal. They do not want to abolish hierarchies, they want to ascend them. Their dream is not of emancipation, but of revenge. Not of tearing down the throne, but of sitting on it. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this dynamic clearly in his critique of slave morality. Those who were weak, marginalized, or defeated could not confront their oppressors directly. So, instead, they developed a moral system that framed their suffering as virtue and their enemy's strength as evil. This was not a moral evolution, it was a strategic inversion. Morality became a battlefield where the oppressed could declare themselves superior, not through power, but through victimhood. And when circumstances allowed them to rise, they often adopted the very tools of domination they once decried. Revolutions throughout history provide vivid evidence. The French Revolution promised liberty and equality, but quickly descended into purges and tyranny. The oppressed peasants of Russia overthrew the Tsarist regime only to install a Soviet system that became equally, if not more, repressive. The colonized, upon gaining independence, often replicated the bureaucratic and hierarchical structures of their former colonizers. The language changed, but the thirst for dominance remained. Michel Foucault would explain this by pointing out that power is not something you simply abolish. It is relational and omnipresent. To occupy any position within a system is to wield and be subjected to power. The oppressed are not immune to this dynamic. In fact, their experience of subjugation often fuels a hunger to reverse roles, not to eliminate them. This is not a judgment of morality, it's an observation of human psychology. Being oppressed does not make one morally superior. Suffering does not purify. It can embitter, radicalize, and distort. When people are humiliated, they internalize not only pain, but rage. And rage, when given opportunity, seeks not balance but retaliation. The abused child may grow into the abusive parent. The bullied student may become the authoritarian teacher. History is full of such tragic recursions. Justice is a rare goal because it requires restraint, empathy, and the willingness to dismantle systems that could benefit you once you're in power. Many do not want justice, they want to win. And winning, in this context, often means inflicting upon others what was once inflicted upon them. This cycle persists because society fails to address the psychology of power. We assume the oppressed want fairness, but we rarely ask what they will do when they hold the reins. Until we do, revolutions will continue to replace one form of oppression with another. New flags, new slogans, same architecture of control. The dream of justice is noble, but the dream of domination is far more common. Every truth is upheld by force or fear. Truth, in the philosophical and political sense, is rarely neutral. It is not a passive discovery of reality, but an active declaration backed by enforcement. Every so-called truth that dominates a society survives not because it is self-evident, but because it is protected by authority, violence, social pressure, or internalized fear. What people call truth is often the residue of power. It is shaped, disseminated, and preserved by those who benefit from its acceptance. And when it is challenged, it is defended not with reason alone, but with consequence. Michel Foucault argued that truth is always embedded in power relations. What counts as truth, in a given time and place, is determined by the institutions that wield influence: churches, states, schools, media. These truths are supported by mechanisms of discipline and punishment. They are taught in classrooms, enforced in courts, and inscribed into the norms of daily life. People do not believe them solely because they are persuaded. They believe because disbelief comes at a cost: social exile, legal penalty, moral condemnation. History provides countless examples. In the Middle Ages, religious dogma was truth, and to question it meant torture or death. During authoritarian regimes, state ideology becomes truth, and those who deviate are imprisoned, re-educated, or executed. Even in liberal democracies, truths are upheld by softer forms of coercion. To question foundational narratives about race, capitalism, gender, or patriotismus, to risk reputational damage, career loss, or social cancellation. These are not abstract fears. They are tools of control. Even scientific truths, which are ideally self-correcting and evidence-based, can be influenced by funding structures, political agendas, and dominant paradigms. Galileo's heliocentrism was not suppressed because it lacked empirical merit. It was suppressed because it threatened the religious political order. The truth was dangerous, not because it was false, but because it undermined authority. What is rarely acknowledged is that people internalize this enforcement. They censor themselves before any punishment is necessary. This is what Foucault described as the internalization of the panopticon, the idea that once you believe you're being watched, you begin to police your own thoughts and speech. Truth becomes a script you repeat not because you understand it, but because deviation feels unsafe. Nietzsche went further, declaring that truth itself is a constructed series of metaphors worn out by repetition. What we call truth is just a historically useful fiction, solidified by habit and protected by fear. When people stop fearing the consequences of dissent, truth begins to unravel. But this is rare. Most societies cultivate fear precisely so that this unraveling never begins. To maintain a dominant truth, systems must suppress competing narratives. Dissenting voices are ridiculed, delegitimized, or erased. This ensures that not only is the truth protected, it is the only option available. People then come to believe not just because they are forced to, but because alternatives are unthinkable. Truth, in this view, is not a mirror of the world, it is a fortress. And it stands not on reason alone, but on the fear that keeps challengers at bay. Human reason is a thin veil over animal instincts. The common story of human development paints reason as our defining trait, what separates us from animals and elevates us above our evolutionary roots. We are told that we are rational beings who sometimes slip into emotional or instinctual lapses. But this narrative is backwards. Human reason is not the core of our being. It is a thin, fragile layer, spread over a vast reservoir of primal urges. Our logic is not sovereign, it is servant to our instincts, often rationalizing after the fact what biology has already decided. Arthur Schopenhauer saw the human will as primary and irrational force that underlies all existence. Reason, he argued, is secondary. It is a tool used by the will to fulfill its blind desires. We do not think in order to know. We think in order to get what we want. Our brains do not guide our actions from a place of neutrality. They are enlisted in the service of survival, reproduction, dominance, and status. Reason helps us calculate strategies, but it rarely questions the goal itself. Modern neuroscience supports this view. Decisions are often made in the limbic system, our emotional and instinctual brain centers, before they even reach conscious awareness. The neocortex, responsible for rational thought, steps in later to provide a justification. This creates the illusion of deliberation. In truth, we are like lawyers defending our gut reactions, not judges weighing evidence impartially. Nietzsche pushed this further by declaring that every philosophy is a confession of its author's instincts. What one believes is less about logical rigor and more about temperament, background, and desire. Philosophical systems are post hoc justifications for psychological drives. Even moral reasoning, which claims to rise above impulse, is often the sublimation of envy, fear, or resentment. Look at how people behave in everyday life. They form tribes, seek out comfort, display aggression, hoard resources, compete for mates and attention. They then use reason to explain why these behaviors are noble, justified, or inevitable. Capitalism becomes rational self-interest. War becomes defense of freedom. Jealousy becomes moral concern. The rationalization of base instincts is not an exception, it is the norm. Societies also institutionalize this dynamic. Legal systems, religious doctrines, and political ideologies are often constructed to manage instincts, not transcend them. They create boundaries around sexual desire, aggression, greed, and fear, but they do not eliminate them. Instead, they channel these drives into controlled expressions. War becomes sport. Lust becomes monogamy. Rage becomes protest. Civilization does not erase the animal, domesticates it. This is not a call to cynicism, it is a call to honesty. To understand human nature, one must start with the instincts and then examine how reason decorates them. The mind is a mask worn by the body, not the other way around. Pretending otherwise leads to a distorted view of our self-image based on fantasy rather than fact. Reason may be our most sophisticated tool, but it is not our foundation. Beneath every calculation lies a craving. Beneath every theory, a need. We are not rational animals, we are animals who reason just enough to serve the beast within. Sexuality is policed to protect societal order, not virtue. Sex is often framed in moral terms, as sacred, sinful, pure, corrupt, liberating, or degrading. But these moral labels are not reflections of eternal truths. They are tools. Sexuality, more than almost any other aspect of human life, is rigorously policed not because it is inherently dangerous, but because it is disruptive to the social order. The control of sex is not about virtue. It is about stability, predictability, and hierarchy. Michel Foucault's groundbreaking work on the history of sexuality revealed that societies do not repress sex to promote morality. They regulate it to manage populations. Sexuality is not just a private behavior. It intersects with power in ways that threaten institutional control. Who can sleep with whom, when, under what conditions, and with what consequences? These are questions that define family structure, inheritance, gender roles, and national identity. To lose control of sexual norms is to risk unraveling the fabric of institutional coherence. Religions have long understood this. By declaring certain sexual acts sinful, they created a framework in which individuals could be morally judged and disciplined. Celibacy became a marker of purity, while sexual indulgence became a sign of weakness or wickedness. But this was never only about spiritual elevation. It was about creating docile, governable subjects. Sexual repression funnels energy into obedience. By making people ashamed of their desires, institutions gain leverage over their behavior. States, too, have a vested interest in sexual control. Marriage laws, reproductive policies, and gender norms are all tools of governance. The nuclear family, for instance, is not a natural arrangement, it is a political one. It creates economic units, clarifies legal responsibilities, and supports capitalist productivity. When sexuality threatens that structure through promiscuity, queerness, or non-traditional relationships, the state often responds not with curiosity, but with legislation. Even science and medicine participate in this policing. The pathologization of non-normative sexualities, labeling them as disorders, perversions, or risks, creates an authoritative framework for control. Sexual education becomes a way to encode normative behavior, not empower personal understanding. The clinic replaces the church, but the function remains the same: surveillance and correction. Importantly, this control is not always repressive in the obvious sense. Modern societies claim to have liberated sex, but in reality, they have reclassified and redistributed it. Instead of shame, we now use data. Instead of sin, we speak of health. But the regulation continues. Apps track preferences. Algorithms predict desire. Bureaucracies monitor reproduction. Sex is no longer taboo. It is monetized, cataloged, and managed. The justification for all of this is virtue, public health, child protection, moral decency. But behind that veneer lies a deeper agenda. Sexual freedom threatens systems because it is unruly. It resists classification, it blurs boundaries, it ignores borders, and because of this, it must be tamed not for moral reasons, but for order. When we understand sexuality as a site of power, not just pleasure, the moral noise begins to fade. What remains is a struggle not between virtue and vice, but between freedom and control. The rules are rarely about what's right, they're about what keeps the machine running smoothly. And anything that disrupts that rhythm, no matter how human or harmless, must be policed. Love is often a desire to possess, not to understand. Love is romanticized as the purest form of human connection, a transcendent emotion that draws two people into mutual understanding. But much of what passes as love in human behavior is not driven by a desire to understand the other, but to possess them. The language of love, "You're mine. I can't live without you. You complete me," betrays its underlying instinct: ownership, Rather than being an act of empathetic insight, love frequently becomes a psychological strategy to secure, control, and internalize another person into one's sense of self. From a Nietzschean standpoint, love is often tied to the will to power. When we fall in love, we don't merely want to coexist, we want to shape, influence, and possess. This possession can be emotional, physical, intellectual, or symbolic. The loved one becomes a mirror in which we wish to see ourselves reflected favorably. Their admiration validates us, their loyalty secures us, and their presence becomes an extension of our ego. The drive to possess masks itself as selflessness, but reveals itself in the fear of loss, jealousy, and the demand for exclusivity. This dynamic is especially visible in how people react when they are rejected or betrayed. The emotional collapse is rarely about understanding the other person's motivations, or pain it is about the shattering of possession. "How could you do this to me?" reveals the underlying assumption that the other's behavior is a breach of ownership. Love, in this context, becomes a contract of entitlement, where the lover expects the other to fulfill needs, mirror desires, and conform to projected roles. Possession also manifests in idealization. To truly understand someone means accepting their contradictions, their flaws, their autonomy. But idealization flattens the other into a fantasy. We fall in love not with who they are, but with who we believe they are, or want them to be. This process turns the beloved into a character in our narrative, rather than an autonomous being with their own untranslatable depth. The moment they act outside our script, disillusionment sets in. Foucault would interpret this as a reflection of broader social mechanisms. The romantic couple is a microcosm of surveillance and control. Lovers monitor each other's behaviors, expectations, and emotional responses. The language of love is filled with implicit regulation. "If you really loved me, you would," becomes a coercive tool. The expectation of transparency in love, knowing each other's thoughts, secrets, fear, can become a demand for vulnerability on command. Intimacy becomes a form of soft domination. This is not to say that love cannot be understanding, but that this is the exception, not the norm. True understanding requires stepping outside one's ego, tolerating discomfort, and allowing the other to exist without being reduced to a function of our desires. Possessive love, by contrast, is about comfort, certainty, and control. It turns the other into a source of emotional security rather than a subject of deep interest. The painful truth is that many people do not want to know their partners, they want to own them. And in that process, love becomes not a bridge between two minds, but a cage with velvet bars. Suffering is not a flaw in life, it is life. Human beings are conditioned to view suffering as a mistake, a disruption of the normal course of things. We speak of pain as something to be fixed, medicated, resolved. But this framework is deeply flawed. Suffering is not an aberration, it is not a glitch in the matrix of existence. It is the matrix. Life, at its core, is not structured around comfort, it is structured around struggle. From the cellular level to the philosophical, suffering is not incidental to life. It is its primary mode of operation. Arthur Schopenhauer built his entire philosophy on this premise. For him, the fundamental force of existence is not reason or goodness, but the will, the blind, insatiable drive to persist and reproduce. This will operates through individuals, compelling them to act, to want, to chase goals they may never achieve. And in that wanting lies suffering. Desire is endless, satisfaction is fleeting. Once one desire is fulfilled, another rises in its place. Life becomes an endless loop of striving and dissatisfaction. This view is echoed in Buddhism, which identifies desire as the root of suffering. But where Buddhism offers a path to transcend desire, Schopenhauer offers no such escape. To live is to suffer. The best one can hope for is momentary reprieve, brief silence in the noise of the will. Modern society tries to cover this truth with distractions. Consumer culture tells us that suffering can be eliminated with the right purchase, therapy, or mindset. Pharmaceutical companies promise happiness in a pill. Self-help gurus sell the illusion of a pain-free life. But all of this is anesthetic, not cure. The pain always returns, often in new forms. Because pain is not a malfunction, it is the engine of growth, change, and awareness. Nietzsche took this idea further. He did not merely accept suffering, he revered it. He believed that greatness, beauty, and depth of character arise not in spite of suffering, but because of it. The person who has never suffered remains shallow. The person who has endured pain and transmuted it into strength becomes more fully human. Suffering, in this view, is the crucible of becoming. It forces us to confront limits, destroy illusions, and build anew. This is not to glorify pain for its own sake, but it is a recognition that to reject suffering is to reject life itself. All of nature operates through conflict, predation, decay, entropy. Even the creative act involves pain. The artist wrestles with uncertainty, the parent with exhaustion, the thinker with doubt. Without suffering, there is no transformation, no insight, no art, no empathy. Foucault would note how institutions seek to manage suffering by categorizing, diagnosing, and regulating it. But in doing so, they often turn existential anguish into pathology. What cannot be labeled becomes invisible. Yet the most profound forms of suffering, the ones tied to meaning, identity, and mortality, resist diagnosis. They are not errors. They are the price of consciousness. To live is to hurt, and to hurt is not to fail at life, it is to participate in it. The only alternative is numbness, and numbness is not living, it is waiting to die. The will to power is stronger than the will to survive. The will to survive is often considered the most basic instinctive biological imperative shared by all living creatures. But for humans, survival is not enough. There exists a deeper, more primal force, the will to power. This is not merely the desire to dominate others, though that is one of its manifestations. It is the drive to expand, assert, overcome, and impose form on chaos. The will to power is what propels individuals to risk their safety, their comfort, even their lives, in pursuit of meaning, legacy, or transcendence. Friedrich Nietzsche identified this force as the core of all human action. While Darwinian biology emphasizes survival and reproduction, Nietzsche saw a higher order of motivation. Humans do not merely want to continue existing, they want to shape existence. They want to matter. And in the pursuit of that, they will often sacrifice the very instinct that is supposed to govern them. Heroes, revolutionaries, artists, martyrs, these figures do not act out of a desire to survive. They act out of a need to express, to assert, to conquer, even in defeat. Consider the soldier who charges into battle knowing he will likely die, the scientist who endures ridicule for a groundbreaking theory, or the activist who sacrifices comfort and safety to speak truth to power. These are not acts of survival. They are acts of affirmation, expressions of a self that refuses to be diminished by fear or constraint. The will to power transcends biological imperatives. It is spiritual, psychological, and symbolic. Even in ordinary life, people make choices that defy the will to survive. They take risks for love, for status, for creative fulfillment. They gamble, they explore, they rebel. Comfort, safety, and longevity are often traded for intensity, meaning, or pride. This is not irrational, it is deeply human. The will to survive keeps the organism alive. The will to power gives that life a direction. Nietzsche saw suffering not as a deterrent, but as a condition of greatness. The will to power does not flee from pain, it absorbs it, transforms it, and uses it as fuel. The individual who embraces this becomes what Nietzsche called the Übermensch person, who creates values, defies conformity, and lives not to survive, but to shape reality. In contrast, those governed solely by the will to survive become docile, timid, and hollow. Foucault might frame this differently, noting how institutions exploit the will to power by channeling it into acceptable paths. Careers, patriotism, consumption. People are told they are free, but their expressions of power are often pre-scripted. True power raw, unfiltered, disruptivized, suppressed in favor of orderly survival. The individual is reduced to a cog in a system that trades potential for predictability. Yet the will to power persists. It erupts in art, revolt, and the refusal to be silenced. It is the source of both civilization and its undoing. Survival is the beginning of life. Power is what makes it worth living. When forced to choose between mere existence and expression, the truly alive will always choose the latter even if it kills them. Man invents meaning because he cannot bear chaos. Chaos is the natural state of the universe. It is the unstructured, unpredictable, uncaring reality that surrounds human existence. There is no inherent direction, no built-in purpose, no cosmic script. Yet humans recoil from this truth. Chaos produces anxiety because it reveals the fragility of everything we hold sacred. So, in response, man invents meaning not because it is discovered, but because it is needed. Meaning becomes the shelter we construct against the storm of existence. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this mechanism. When he declared that God is dead, he wasn't simply attacking religion, he was diagnosing the collapse of traditional meaning structures. Without God, there was no longer a fixed morality, no divine plan, no assurance of cosmic justice. What remained was the abyss. And faced with that abyss, people either invent new meanings or fall into nihilism. Nietzsche feared that most would choose the latter unless they found a way to create meaning through strength, not illusion. Meaning is a psychological necessity. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We interpret events through narrative, assign roles, identify beginnings and endings. Tragedies must have lessons, suffering must have causes, life must have goals. Without these constructs, reality becomes intolerable. Even pain is more bearable when it is framed within a meaningful context. A meaningless pain, however, becomes existentially corrosive. Religion, philosophy, art, politics all are systems that provide meaning. They impose order on the formless. They give people a sense of identity, a cause to fight for, a belief to sacrifice for. But none of these systems are natural. They are inventions, useful fictions, crafted by minds desperate to escape the terror of randomness. Michel Foucault would argue that meaning is imposed through institutions of power. Schools teach national history, not objective history. Media frames events through ideology, not neutrality. Language itself is structured to reinforce certain norms and erase others. The result is a socially constructed reality where meaning is less about truth and more about control. People internalize these meanings as if they were self-evident, never realizing that their thoughts have been pre-assembled by systems they did not choose. This is why crises of meaning are so destabilizing. When a belief system collapses, whether religious, political, or personal, it is not just an intellectual shift, it is a psychic trauma. The world becomes unrecognizable. People respond by clinging harder to old narratives, adopting new ideologies with cult-like zeal, or numbing themselves with distraction. Anything to avoid the confrontation with chaos. Meaning, then, is not a discovery, it is a defense mechanism. It gives the illusion of coherence where there is none. It allows humans to navigate a world that offers no guarantees. But this invention comes with a cost. When meanings harden into dogmas, they stifle thought. When they are enforced through violence, they become oppressive. And when they are mistaken for truth, they become dangerous. To live honestly is to recognize that meaning is man-made, not God-given. It is to hold our narratives loosely, to create with humility, and to admit that beneath it all, there is chaos and that we, fragile creatures, have chosen stories over silence. Philosophy is not the pursuit of wisdom, it's the pursuit of dominance over other minds. Philosophy presents itself as a noble endeavor, the love of wisdom, the dispassionate search for truth. But behind its rhetoric of objectivity lies a more primal motive, the desire to dominate intellectually. Philosophy is not just about understanding the world, it is about shaping how others understand it. It is not a neutral discourse, it is a contest. A duel fought not with swords, but with concepts. And its battlefield is the human mind. Every philosophical system, no matter how abstract or altruistic, contains an implicit assertion. This is the way the world is, and this is how you should think, whether it's Plato's theory of forms, Descartes' rationalism, or Kant's categorical imperative. Each framework doesn't just explain, it commands. It structures thought. It rewrites how people interpret reality. To construct a philosophy is to construct a lens through which others must see. This is not just interpretation, it is conquest. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this clearly. He argued that philosophy is often the confession of its creator's psychologia, sublimated expression of will to power. Philosophers claim to be seeking truth, but what they are really doing is imposing their temperament, their values, their anxieties onto the universe. The Stoic demands control over emotion because he fears its chaos. The utilitarian reduces life to calculus because he craves order. The moral philosopher builds a system not out of pure logic, but out of a desire to dominate moral discourse. Academic philosophy is no different. In universities, philosophical debate becomes a performance. Scholars use jargon as gatekeeping. They write for approval, citation, and prestige. Their success is not measured by clarity or usefulness, but by how well they defeat intellectual rivals. The classroom becomes a training ground in rhetorical combat. The goal is not always to illuminate but to out-argue, to silence dissent, to become the authority others must reference or obey. Michel Foucault would analyze this as another mechanism of power. Philosophy, like all discourses, operates within institutions. It constructs truths that become normative. These truths are then institutionalized, taught in curricula, embedded in laws, reflected in public policy. The philosopher becomes the architect of intellectual structures that govern thought. This is not wisdom in the ancient sensate, his domination through abstraction. Even popular philosophy is not immune. When a thinker captures the public imagination, Ayn Rand, Jordan Peterson, Slavoj Žižek are not simply sharing ideas. They are building tribes, asserting intellectual authority, and influencing how thousands interpret morality, politics, and meaning. Their power lies not in truth, but in persuasion. Philosophy becomes a tool of psychological leadership. This does not render philosophy worthless, but it reveals its nature. Philosophy is a struggle for influence. It is a way to assert vision, values, and voice over others. The pursuit of wisdom may be its mythic ideal, but its practice often reveals a deeper instinct to win the war for minds. The self is a mask worn by desire. What we call the self is often treated as a stable, unified identity, something core to our being, unchanging and authentic. But under closer scrutiny, this self begins to dissolve. It reveals itself not as a fixed essence but as a performance, a social costume, a collection of roles we play to navigate the world. Beneath this mask is not some pure soul but desire. The self is not a sovereign entity, it is an actor motivated by hunger, by longing, by a will that constantly shifts shape in pursuit of gratification. Desire is not just something the self possesses, it is the engine that constructs the self. We become who we are by wanting approval, wanting success, wanting to be seen in a certain light. The traits we emphasize, the values we espouse, the personas we adopt are all shaped by what we hope to achieve. This does not make them false, but it does make them contingent. The self is less a truth to discover and more a strategy of presentation. Nietzsche understood this well. He dismissed the idea of a permanent self as a metaphysical illusion. He saw identity as fluid, driven by forces beneath our conscious control. The philosopher, the artist, the moralist all are shaped by subterranean desires, by instincts masked as principles. Even self-sacrifice, often viewed as the height of moral clarity, is frequently driven by the desire to be seen as good, noble, or indispensable. Michel Foucault extended this into his theories of subjectivity. He argued that the self is not a pre-existing being, but a product of discourse and power. Our sense of identity is constructed through language, institutions, norms, and surveillance. We internalize social expectations, then express them as if they were authentic impulses. The mask becomes indistinguishable from the face, but it is still a mask. The desires we think are our own are often implanted, shaped by advertising, media, family, and ideology. Even rebellion becomes a mask. The one who prides themselves on being different, edgy, or nonconformist is often just responding to another set of desires. To stand out, to be noticed, to escape mediocrity. The content of the self may change, but the structure remains the Samian expression of desire filtered through performance. This raises an uncomfortable question. If the self is shaped by desire, and desire is shaped by external forces, where is authenticity? The answer may be that authenticity itself is another desirea, noble one, but no less constructed. We want to feel real. We want to escape the layers of performance. And so we build a new identity around being authentic, which quickly becomes another mask. To understand the self is not to find an inner truth. It is to peel away the layers of performance and see the desiring machinery underneath. The self is not a thing. It is a theater. And every mask we wear is both a revelation and a concealment of what we want, what we fear, and what we hope to become. What you call morality is just domesticated instinct. Morality is often revered as the highest expression of human reason, and spirituality a system of values that separates us from animals and elevates us above primal urges. But this idealized view collapses when morality is examined through the lens of instinct. What people call morality is not the triumph of reason over naturit, is nature, repackaged and disciplined. Morality is not a set of transcendental truths handed down from the heavens. It is a social technology that refines, redirects, and contains instinctual drives so they can function within the constraints of civilization. The core instincts, self-preservation, aggression, mating, hierarchy, territoriality are not eliminated by morality. They are rebranded. The aggressive drive becomes righteous anger, often celebrated when aimed at social injustices or ideological enemies. Sexual desire is refined into romantic love or socially sanctioned monogamy. The survival instinct becomes thrift, discipline, or ambition. These drives are no less animalistic. They have simply been dressed in moral language to make them compatible with the needs of group living. Friedrich Nietzsche exposed this dynamic in his analysis of slave morality. He argued that traditional values such as humility, obedience, and meekness were not inherently good, but were born out of weakness. The oppressed, unable to express their instincts directly through force or conquest, reframed their impotence as virtue. Morality, in this sense, became a psychological compromise, a way for people to feel powerful while remaining powerless. Their instincts were not eradicated, they were sublimated. Arthur Schopenhauer saw morality as emerging from compassion, but even this so-called higher instinct is still instinctual. Compassion is not a rational deduction, it is an emotional reflex, shaped by evolutionary pressures to protect kin or foster cooperation. When one feels pity or empathy, it is not a result of abstract ethical calculation, but of a visceral, often involuntary response. Morality is instinct cleaned up and made respectable. Social institutions play a crucial role in domesticating these instincts. Education systems teach children not to hit, but to use their words. Religious systems convert guilt into salvation pathways. Legal systems channel vengeance into court proceedings. What's being trained is not moral reasoning, but behavioral compliance. Children are punished not because they are morally wrong, but because their instincts are disruptive. Over time, they internalize these codes. The instinct is not removed, it is made invisible through habit and reward. Michel Foucault would call this process disciplinary conditioning. Morality is administered through institutions that shape bodies and minds. Prisons, hospitals, schools, and churches do not simply teach values, they manufacture them. People come to see their conditioned responses as freely chosen principles, never realizing how deeply their instincts have been curated by external forces. This does not mean morality is meaningless, but it does mean that morality is not as pure or autonomous as we imagine. It is the domestication of the animal, in man a necessary compromise for social life, but still rooted in the very instincts it claims to transcend. Behind every virtue lies a tamed drive. Behind every rule, a redirected impulse. Morality is not the absence of instinct. It is instinct in a leash and collar, trained to sit when commanded and rewarded for good behavior. We don't speak language, language speaks us. Language is often thought of as a tool we use to express our thoughts, emotions, and intentions. But this understanding reverses the real dynamic. We do not simply wield language. We are shaped by it, confined by it, and often dictated by it. Language precedes the individual. It defines the contours of thought, determines the range of what can be said, and subtly enforces the boundaries of what can be thought. Before we learn to speak, language already exists encoded in culture, history, and power. And once we speak, it speaks through us. Michel Foucault and structuralist thinkers like Ferdinand de Saussure and Jacques Derrida dismantled the illusion of linguistic autonomy. Saussure argued that language is a system of signs, where meaning arises not from a fixed relationship between words and things, but from differences between words themselves. We don't understand cold because it corresponds to some objective essence. We understand it in contrast to hot. This relational structure means that language doesn't reflect reality, it constructs it. Foucault took this further by exploring how language becomes the vehicle of discourse and how discourse produces subjects. A person labeled mad, criminal, or deviant is not just being described. They are being constructed within a specific linguistic and institutional framework. These labels don't describe identity, they create it. Once someone is named, categorized, and placed within a discursive system, their possibilities for action and recognition are shaped accordingly. Language not only communicates, power it wields it. Language also shapes internal consciousness. The thoughts we think, the feelings we can name, and the narratives we construct about ourselves are all mediated through language. A culture that has no word for a specific emotion renders that emotion less accessible or even invisible. This is not a matter of vocabulary, it is a matter of experience. We do not access raw reality and then label it. We experience a reality already filtered through the linguistic categories we have absorbed. Our mental lives are not private islands, they are linguistic territories inherited from others. Even rebellion is framed by language. When someone challenges a dominant system, they must do so within the very language that system has authorized. There is no speaking position outside language. Even silence becomes meaningful only within a cultural linguistic context. Language thus acts not only as a cage, but as a paradox. We can never fully escape it, yet we must use it to seek freedom. Nietzsche understood this trap when he described language as a mobile army of metaphors. He knew that words are not windows to truth, but weapons of persuasion. They create illusions of permanence and precision where none exist. Concepts like justice, soul, or freedom appear stable, but their meanings are constantly shifting, shaped by whoever has the authority to define them at any given moment. To say that language speaks us is to acknowledge that we are not sovereign speakers, but vessels of inherited syntax, semantics, and structure. We echo centuries of accumulated phrases, assumptions, and ideas. What we call original thought is often a remix of existing linguistic frameworks. The illusion of linguistic control persists because it comforts the ego. But the deeper reality is that language thinks through us before we even begin to think. Human beings are more conditioned than conscious. Consciousness is commonly celebrated as the pinnacle of human evolution, the light of awareness that separates us from instinct-driven animals. But this celebration masks a deeper and more unsettling truth. Most human behavior is not guided by conscious intention, but by conditioning. We are the products of training, habit, and repetition. What we call free will is often just an after-the-fact rationalization of choices that were made unconsciously, shaped by past rewards, punishments, and reinforcements. The bulk of human behavior unfolds automatically. From language acquisition to social norms, people absorb the rules of engagement long before they understand them. Children learn not by reasoning through morality, but by responding to approval and punishment. They sit still because teachers praise obedience. They apologize because parents scold them when they don't. These behaviors eventually become automatic, requiring no reflection. The conscious mind is not the driver, it is the narrator. B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist psychologist, argued that free will is an illusion. Human beings behave in accordance with reinforcement schedules. If a behavior leads to a reward, it is repeated. If it leads to punishment, it is suppressed. This is not limited to rats in a lab, it applies to human beings in school, work, relationships, and culture. Conditioning is not just something that happens to use, it defines us. Michel Foucault identified a more insidious form of conditioning, discipline disguised as freedom. Modern institutions don't just punish disobedience, they shape bodies and minds through subtle rituals. Schools create punctual students. Factories create efficient workers. Prisons create docile subjects. Even entertainment conditions, attention spans, emotional reactions, and desires. People internalize these patterns and come to believe that their compliance is voluntary. The conditioning becomes invisible and thus more effective. This applies not just to behavior, but to identity. What one believes to be their personality is often just the sediment of repeated exposure and reaction. A child, labeled smart or troublemaker, will often grow into that label, not because it is true, but because it was reinforced. What people think they are is often a loop. An initial behavior provokes a response, which provokes repetition, which becomes identity. Even thoughts are conditioned. Beliefs do not arise from pure contemplation. They are inherited from culture, family, education, and media. The political views, religious beliefs, and moral codes people hold were usually implanted long before they had the tools to question them. And when questioning does occur, it often leads not to liberation, but to the adoption of a different, equally conditioned worldview. The illusion of waking up is often just the embrace of a new script. Consciousness plays a role, but it is rarely in charge. Most decisions are made below the surface, emotionally, habitually, impulsively. The conscious mind then steps in to provide a story, a justification, a sense of coherence. This narrative is comforting, but false. The deeper truth is that human beings are conditioned creatures who occasionally become aware of their conditioning, only to explain it away as choice. The real revolution is not in changing one's mind, but in realizing how little of it was ever truly one's own. You are a puppet of the culture you never chose. From the moment you are born, you are immersed in a system of symbols, expectations, values, and norms that you did not create, did not select, and cannot fully escape. This system is called culture, and while it often feels invisible, it pulls your strings at every level. What you believe, what you desire, what you fear, and how you interpret the world are not private constructions. They are collective implants. The language you speak, the God you worship or reject, the idea of success you pursue, of these are cultural products delivered to you prepackaged before you were old enough to question them. The illusion of autonomy is sustained by choice within boundaries. You can choose between brands, between political parties, between lifestyles, but the framework of those choices has already been set. You were taught what is desirable, respectable, admirable, shameful, sacred, and obscene long before you could defend those beliefs with reason. The culture teaches you how to speak, but also what can and cannot be said. It teaches you to question, but only within permissible limits. You are praised for curiosity, as long as it does not threaten the consensus. Michel Foucault showed how institutions, such as schools, hospitals, and prisons, operate as apparatuses of control. But beyond that, he emphasized that discourse itself, what is thinkable and sayable, governed by cultural power. What you call yourself is not a free-standing entity. It is a cultural construction, the result of internalized scripts. Even your sense of rebellion is often a performance within a cultural category. You may define yourself as alternative, but that identity, too, has been commodified and categorized by the very system you think you're resisting. Your desires are not born in a vacuum, they are engineered by advertising, myth, and narrative. What you find attractive, what you consider meaningful, even how you experience emotions, these are shaped by media, religion, tradition, and social conditioning. Love is scripted by cinema, masculinity by politics, femininity by marketing. Even your deepest values, freedom, equality, truth-are interpretations, you inherited, not discovered. Friedrich Nietzsche recognized that most people are cultural echoes. Their morality, their indignation, their ambitions are second-hand. They are puppets repeating what they've been taught to say. To become an individual, in any real sense, requires not just critique, but rupture. It requires a painful detachment from the narratives that built your identity. Most avoid this because it feels like death. And in a way, it is. The culturally constructed self must die for the autonomous self to be born, if such a self can exist at all. Culture is not just external. It is inside you. It shapes how you dream, how you speak to yourself, how you measure your worth. You carry your puppet strings into every relationship, every decision, every judgment. And unless you begin to trace those strings back to their source, you will dance not to your own rhythm, but to one composed by voices long gone, voices you never chose, but obey without question. Artists and thinkers are often more cruel than the tyrants they despise. Artists and intellectuals are commonly romanticized as the conscience of society-sensitive souls attuned to injustice, visionaries who challenge power and inspire liberation. But this perception obscures a more uncomfortable truth. Artists and thinkers are frequently driven by the same impulses as the tyrants they critique. The desire to dominate, to impose a vision, to reshape the world according to personal ideals, these are not exclusive to political leaders. They are deeply embedded in the creative and intellectual psyche. The difference lies not in motive, but in method. Friedrich Nietzsche understood the creative drive as a form of the will to power. The artist does not merely express, he commands. He selects, edits, elevates, and destroys. The intellectual does not merely analyze. He constructs systems, frameworks, and dogmas that demand obedience. Behind every great philosophy lies a temperament seeking supremacy over rival ideas, over the herd, over reality itself. The thinker may appear calm, but his logic is a sword. The artist may appear tender, but his beauty is a weapon. This desire for dominance becomes especially dangerous when artists and thinkers believe themselves morally superior. Unlike tyrants, who often admit their use of power, intellectuals and creatives cloak their control in righteousness. They believe their vision justifies the casualties. The revolutionary poet calls for fire and blood. The philosopher of utopia accepts purges as necessary. The avant-garde filmmaker demolishes traditions, leaving confusion in his wake, and calls it progress. In the name of truth, beauty, or awakening, they inflict chaos and often walk away before dealing with the aftermath. History is full of examples. Robespierre, architect of the French Reign of Terror, was a philosopher before he was an executioner. Lenin was a reader of Hegel and Marx before he engineered mass repression. The cultural revolutionaries in China, many of them students and artists, enacted brutal violence in the name of ideological purity. Closer to the personal realm, great authors, composers, and painters have destroyed families, abandoned children, abused lovers not in spite of their genius, but often because they saw themselves as above ordinary constraints. Michel Foucault warned that knowledge itself is a form of power. To create a system of thought is to define the terms of reality. Once an idea gains traction, it governs behavior, shapes discourse, and excludes dissent. Intellectual cruelty is not loud, it is silent, systemic, invisible. It shows up in the way schools teach, in the way psychiatry labels, in the way art movements dismiss what came before. The cruelty lies in the erasure of opposing voices, the dismissal of nuance, the glorification of the new for its own sake. The artist and the tyrant may wear different costumes, but they are often driven by the same fire, a refusal to accept the world as it is and a compulsion to bend it into their image. The cruelty is not always physical. It can be emotional, ideological, or cultural, but it is real, and because it hides behind a veil of enlightenment, it often escapes scrutiny. The hands that paint revolutions are not always clean. Sometimes, they are bloodier than those of the kings they condemn. Liberation is often another form of control. Liberation is one of the most seductive promises in human history. Movements arise under its banner, revolutions are waged in its name, and entire ideologies define themselves by their commitment to freeing people from oppression. But liberation, when examined closely, often functions not as a break from control but as its replacement. It removes one authority only to install another. It dismantles old chains while slipping on new ones, softer perhaps, but no less binding. The liberated subject is rarely free. They are simply governed by different rules, rituals, and norms. Michel Foucault spent much of his career exposing how systems of power evolve rather than disappear. When prisons replace torture, when therapy replaces confession, when democracy replaces monarchy, what emerges is not freedom in the absolute sense, but new mechanisms of control that are internalized, decentralized, and often invisible. Liberation from a tyrant may eliminate brute force, but it gives rise to surveillance, normalization, and the self-discipline of the free individual who polices their own behavior. This is not merely theoretical. Consider modern capitalism's embrace of liberation. You are now free to be yourself, to express your identity, to pursue your desires. But those desires are shaped by algorithms, sold back to you through marketing, and evaluated through metrics like social media engagement. You are liberated from the moral rigidity of tradition, but you are now enslaved to your image, your data profile, your online reputation. You may have exited the prison cell, but the cell has been replaced by a mirror, and you never stop looking. Revolutionary politics reveals the same pattern. Those who free people from colonialism often become dictators. Those who abolish the aristocracy often form new elites. The slogans change, but the structure remains. The population is told they are liberated, but their speech is monitored, their movements tracked, their loyalty demanded. Even ideologies that champion personal freedom liberalism, libertarianism still, impose frameworks that define what freedom is allowed to look like. Deviate too far from the approved narrative of freedom, and you are marginalized or silenced. Friedrich Nietzsche would call this the transvaluation of values. The new masters declare their values to be morally superior, and in doing so, demand obedience no less than the ones they overthrew. The individual does not become free, they are simply moralized differently. What was once sin is now offense. What was once heresy is now misinformation. The words change, but the command remains: obey. Even in personal development, the illusion of liberation masks control. You liberate yourself from negative thought patterns only, to become a servant to optimization culture. You are free to live your best life, as long as it aligns with productivity, mindfulness, and curated authenticity. The chains are now internal. You meditate because you should. You hustle because you must. The whip is gone, but the compulsion remains. Liberation, then, is not inherently false, but it is rarely pure. It often functions as a rebranding of power, not its abolition. The question is not whether you are free, but whose values govern your sense of freedom, and whether the voice calling you to liberation is your own or just another mask worn by the system. Man creates enemies to feel alive. Conflict is not an aberration in human life. It is often the source of identity, direction, and purpose. When individuals or societies lack enemies, they tend to invent them. Whether those enemies are external, another country, ideology, or race, or internal, a political opponent, a scapegoated group, a toxic personality, the psychological function remains the same. The enemy gives shape to the self. The presence of an adversary provides a sense of meaning that comfort and peace rarely offer. Nietzsche recognized that opposition was essential to vitality. He argued that life itself is will to power the struggle, not just to survive, but to assert, to overcome, to triumph. In this view, enemies are not accidental, they are necessary. The act of overcoming something external mirrors the inner drama of becoming. People define themselves through resistance. A person without obstacles has no reason to act, no reason to change, no reason to grow. In contrast, an enemy, even a fictional or exaggerated one, summons strength, commitment, and identity. Michel Foucault would add that power relations are defined through opposition. Institutions, ideologies, and identities form boundaries by naming what they are not. A political regime defines itself against its dissenters. A religion defines its orthodoxy against heresy. A social movement often gains momentum not through coherent goals, but through shared hatred of a common antagonist. These enemies can be caricatures constructed, more from fear and projection than from reality. But their function is real. They unify, they energize, and they distract. On the personal level, enemies serve as external containers for internal chaos. It is easier to despise someone else than to examine oneself. Rather than confront personal inadequacies or uncertainties, individuals project those onto others. The cruel boss becomes the symbol of all oppression, the ex-partner, the emblem of betrayal, the rival, the cause of failure. This externalization of conflict offers catharsis. It gives emotional heat a target. The enemy becomes a psychological scapegoat. This dynamic is why peace often feels boring. In the absence of enemies, people lose focus. They turn on each other, or on themselves. The culture of outrage, the constant political polarization, the ceaseless tribalism online, these are not signs of collective decay, but of a deep existential hunger for definition. People are more afraid of apathy than they are of division. Hatred offers energy. Fear offers coherence. The enemy becomes the stage on which the self performs. The most terrifying enemy is not the one who threatens you, but the one who disappears. When your enemy vanishes, you are left with yourself. And for many, that is intolerable. So they seek new adversaries, reinvent old ones, or reframe minor annoyances as existential threats. This is not irrational, it is human. The enemy gives the story conflict. Without conflict, the narrative stalls. To be human is to struggle. And when the real struggle fades, man creates a symbolic one. He raises new banners, draws new lines, and manufactures new threats. Not because he needs to win, but because he needs to feel that he is still in the fight. In a world stripped of enemies, man risks forgetting who he is. People obey not because they believe, but because they fear. Obedience is often mistaken for agreement. It is assumed that when people follow rules, uphold systems, or comply with authority, they do so because they are persuaded, because they believe in the legitimacy of the power above them. But history and psychology both suggest otherwise. Most people obey not out of conviction but out of fear. Fear of punishment, fear of exclusion, fear of uncertainty. Obedience is less a sign of consent than it is a symptom of intimidation. Michel Foucault explored how modern societies maintain order not through overt violence, but through internalized surveillance. Institutions such as schools, prisons, and workplaces train individuals to monitor themselves. The threat of being watched or judged, even if only hypothetically, becomes enough to ensure obedience. You don't need a policeman on every corner if people believe they are always being evaluated. The fear is not necessarily of physical punishment, but of social and psychological consequence, shame, dismissal, disapproval, or banishment. This fear is ingrained early. Children learn to obey to avoid punishment, not because they understand rules as moral imperatives. In adulthood, the dynamic simply evolves. People follow workplace codes, social etiquette, and political norms, not because they are universally just, but because disobedience carries costs. The system doesn't need believers. It needs conformists. And conformists are easy to manage when fear replaces the need for persuasion. Consider totalitarian regimes where millions comply with brutal orders. The myth is that propaganda brainwashes the masses. But more often, people see through the lies. They simply fear the consequences of dissent. They pretend to believe because real belief is irrelevant. The system doesn't care what you think. It cares what you do. This logic extends to democracies as well. Citizens may resent laws, mistrust politicians, or ridicule institutions, but they obey. Not because they are convinced, but because rebellion is inconvenient, risky, or costly. Social pressure compounds this dynamic. People fear isolation even more than authority. To disobey is to become other, to be labeled deviant, irrational, dangerous. When the crowd follows, the individual follows not from shared belief, but from fear of being alone. Moral courage is rare, not because it is hard to think differently, but because it is hard to stand differently. Friedrich Nietzsche would see this obedience as rooted in the herd instinct. Most people prefer safety over truth, comfort over authenticity. They obey because it keeps them from having to confront their own responsibilities. To obey is to outsource morality. If something goes wrong, the blame can be shifted upward. "I was just following orders" is not just a legal defense, is a psychological defense against guilt. Obedience, then, is not a moral act. It is a tactical one. It is the path of least resistance in a world where resistance often brings punishment. Systems thrive not by convincing everyone they are right, but by convincing everyone that disobedience is dangerous. And in such systems, the difference between a good citizen and a frightened one is not belief, it is silence. Ethics is the camouflage of appetite. Ethics is often held up as a rational system of values, a code that transcends desire and ensures fairness, justice, and restraint. But beneath the surface, ethics frequently operates not as a check on appetite, but as its disguise. Behind every moral principle lies a preference. Behind every call for fairness, a vested interest. Ethics is not always the suppression of desire, it is its justification, its mask, its alibi. Friedrich Nietzsche unmasked this illusion in his critique of morality. He argued that so-called moral values are not eternal truths, but cultural constructs shaped by the desires of those who lack power. The weak call selfishness a sin because they are too powerless to be selfish. The poor glorify humility because it is the only virtue accessible to them. Ethics becomes a tool for transforming powerlessness into a moral advantage. It is appetite dressed in sanctimony. Even altruism can be self-serving. The person who gives to charity may do so for status, validation, or emotional satisfaction. The ethic of sacrifice often rewards the sacrificer with admiration, a sense of superiority, or moral leverage. What appears to be restraint may in fact be a different form of consumption, feeding the ego instead of the body. Michel Foucault would see ethics as a form of social control. Societies define ethical norms that reflect the appetite of dominant groups. What is deemed deviant or immoral often threatens the interests of those in power. The outlaw is not evil, he is simply disobedient. The taboo is not unnatural, it is unprofitable or unmanageable. Ethics, then, serves as a regulatory system to discipline appetites that do not serve the system's appetite. Appetites can also be collective. Nationalism masks territorial greed in the language of patriotism. Religious dogma frames political conquest as divine mission. Corporate ethics manuals sanitize exploitation with slogans about values and vision. The appetite remains whether for land, power, wealth, or dominance, but ethics provides the socially acceptable narrative. It lets one pursue desire while claiming moral high ground. Even philosophical ethics is not immune. Utilitarianism, for instance, claims to maximize happiness for the greatest number. But what counts as happiness, and for whom, is always decided by someone. Deontological ethics insists on duty. But whose duty and toward what ends? Every system hides subjective appetite beneath the pretense of objectivity. Philosophy, too, is a terrain of disguised desire. This does not mean that ethics is useless or fake. It means ethics must be interrogated. Not just what the rules are, but who wrote them. Not just what values are promoted, but what instincts they serve. Ethics may indeed restrain appetite, but only after it has determined which appetites to restrain and which to reward. In the end, to say that ethics is the camouflage of appetite is to recognize that morality is not the enemy of desire, it is one of its most sophisticated tools. And until we see the craving beneath the code, we risk mistaking obedience for virtue and self-interest for righteousness. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. The common belief that power corrupts assumes that individuals are essentially moral or neutral, and that the acquisition of power is what turns them into tyrants. But this perspective overlooks a more unsettling possibility. Power doesn't create corruption, it unmasks it. Power strips away the need to pretend, exposing the true priorities, insecurities, and appetites of the individual. It removes the social constraints that keep behavior in check and allows the person to act without fear of consequence. In that freedom, the hidden self surfaces. Friedrich Nietzsche understood power not merely as political authority, but as a fundamental human drive. Every person possesses a will to power the instinct to assert oneself, influence others, shape the world according to one's vision. In most people, this drive is muted, not by virtue, but by limitation. They lack the position, resources, or confidence to act on their will. But when those limits are lifted, when someone is elevated, protected, or idolized, their inner drives no longer need to be suppressed. This explains why power often surprises observers. The quiet man becomes a tyrant. The idealist becomes an authoritarian. The reformer becomes the oppressor. The truth is, they were always capable of this. Their morality was circumstantial. Their restraint was situational. Power didn't warp them, it liberated them. The villain was hiding under the hero's cape all along. Michel Foucault viewed power as relational, rather than a commodity possessed by individuals. But even in his framework, the exposure effect of power is visible. Institutions that gain unchecked authority, religions, states, corporations, begin to exhibit behaviors that reveal their foundational logic. A church may preach humility while accumulating wealth. A democracy may speak of liberty while surveilling its citizens. The hypocrisy is not an accident. It is the revelation of the institution's true values once it no longer needs to mask them. The idea that power corrupts provides a convenient moral narrative. It allows us to maintain a belief in essential goodness, with corruption blamed on external influence. But the idea that power reveals forces a more difficult reckoning. It means we must look at who we are when no one is watching. It means our ethics may be a matter of necessity, not principle. And it means that institutions are not made corrupt by power. They are designed by people whose true selves may never have had the opportunity to be revealed until authority was granted. This also reframes the way we view leadership. To give someone power is not to see what they become, it is to see what they are. Authority is a mirror. What it reflects may be shocking not because it is new, but because it was always there, hidden under the polite mask of powerlessness. The dangerous are not made, they are unmasked. Power is not the corrupter. It is the great revealer. and those who fear losing it often do so not because it will ruin them, but because it will show others who they really are. To seek truth is to challenge the sacred. Truth is celebrated as a noble ideal, but in practice, the pursuit of truth often brings conflict, exile, or even death. This is because truth, especially inconvenient truth, does not simply illuminate. It threatens. It challenges the sacred, those deeply held beliefs, myths, and rituals that form the foundation of a society's identity. Sacred beliefs do not require evidence, they require loyalty. And to question them is not an intellectual act, it is a moral transgression. Throughout history, truth seekers have been cast as heretics, blasphemers, traitors. Socrates was executed for corrupting the youth with critical thinking. Galileo was condemned for challenging the cosmological order sanctioned by the Church. Spinoza was excommunicated for his philosophical critiques of religious dogma. In each case, the pursuit of truth collided with systems that depended on belief, not inquiry, to maintain cohesion and authority. Sacred beliefs serve a social function. They unify communities, establish norms, and legitimize power. They provide meaning in a chaotic world. But because they are taken as self-evident, they are fragile. The moment someone dares to question them, the illusion of certainty begins to crumble. Defenders of the sacred respond with outrage, not because they are rationally refuting the challenger, but because they sense the existential threat posed by doubt. The sacred cannot tolerate scrutiny. It must remain unquestioned to remain powerful. Michel Foucault argued that truth is not independent of power. What counts as truth in any society is shaped by dominant institutions, religion, law, science, media. These institutions produce, regulate, and enforce what is allowed to be true. Thus, the pursuit of truth is not just an epistemological act, it is a political one. It disrupts hierarchies. It destabilizes narratives. It exposes the machinery behind what people take for granted. Even in secular societies, sacred ideas persist. National identity, progress, equality, meritocracy, these are the new sacred. They are treated as untouchable foundations, and those who challenge them are often marginalized or vilified. To suggest that a democratic state can be unjust, that capitalism has structural flaws, or that scientific paradigms can be ideological is to court suspicion. The language of conspiracy or extremism is deployed to protect the sacred under the guise of rationality. The most sacred truths are those we don't even recognize as beliefs. They are the water we swim in, invisible until disturbed. And the truth seeker becomes dangerous, not because they bring chaos, but because they bring clarity. They remind people that the sacred is not eternal, it is constructed. And what is constructed can be deconstructed. To seek truth is not merely to ask, what is real, but to challenge, what are we forbidden to question? The truth seeker becomes a threat not because they know too much, but because they are willing to go where others will not. They touch the sacred with bare hands and, for that, they are feared. All identities are masks made for social games. Identity is treated as sacred, personal, and authentic, an expression of who someone really is. But identity is not a pure reflection of the self. It is a performance constructed for recognition. It is not discovered in isolation, it is assembled in the presence of others. Every identity, no matter how deeply felt, is a mask crafted to navigate the rules, expectations, and hierarchies of social life. The self may be complex, contradictory, and fluid, but identity is what is allowed to surface, shaped to fit the stage. The philosopher Irving Goffman famously described social interaction as theatrical. People are actors, roles are scripts, and settings determine performance. In this framework, identity is not an internal essence revealed to the world, it is a role played for others. Whether you are a student, a leader, an activist, or a mother, you are engaging in a socially recognized character. These identities are not freely chosen, they are shaped by context, audience, and cultural scripts. Michel Foucault pushed this further by arguing that identities are produced by discourse and power. Institutions such as medicine, psychiatry, education, and religion define what kinds of identities are valid and which are deviant. A person is not simply gay, mentally ill, or criminal. They are made into that identity through systems that name, define, and manage them. Identity becomes a form of control. It turns people into knowable, governable subjects. The mask is not just worn for the sake of performance, is placed there by structures that need people to play certain roles. Even rebellion becomes part of the social game. The outsider, the nonconformist, the radical. These too are identities with expectations, aesthetics, and social capital. To reject all masks is to become unreadable, socially unintelligible. So even in defiance, people adopt a mask to remain legible. What feels like authenticity is often just switching one costume for another. Social media amplifies this theatricality. Online platforms reward identity as performance curated, branded, and optimized for attention. People craft personas not based on inner truth, but on algorithmic feedback. The identity that gets likes, shares, and praise becomes reinforced, while other parts of the self are edited out. The person is reduced to a mask that fits the feed. This does not mean identity is meaningless. It means it is strategic. It is a tool we use to survive and connect. But the danger arises when we forget that it is a mask. When people begin to believe they are only what they present, they become imprisoned by their roles. They lose access to the parts of themselves that don't fit the costume. They become trapped in a performance that once felt empowering but now feels suffocating. Identity is a negotiation. It is shaped by desire, shaped by pressure, and shaped by the social games we must play. To wear a mask is not wrong, it is inevitable. But to believe the mask is your face is to forget that behind every identity lies a deeper, messier self that no stage was ever built to hold. You don't think freely. You think within a cage. Freedom of thought is one of the most celebrated illusions of the modern world. We are taught to believe that our ideas are our own, that our judgments are formed through independent reasoning, and that the ability to think freely is a birthright of rational beings. But the reality is far less romantic. Thought is not born in a vacuum, it is born in a cage. That cage is language, culture, education, media, ideology, and personal experience, all shaped by forces that were operating on you long before you were capable of self-reflection. Every word you use to construct a thought was given to you. The categories you think in right and wrong, good and evil, success and failure were already established by the time you arrived in the world. The structures of logic, the rules of discourse, the very architecture of argumentation were handed down by traditions you did not choose. You may move the furniture inside the cage, but the bars remain untouched. Michel Foucault argued that knowledge and discourse are regulated by institutions of power. Schools don't just teach facts, they teach ways of thinking. Prisons don't just punish, they produce subjects. Psychiatry doesn't just treat, it defines what is normal and what is deviant. These systems determine the boundaries of what is thinkable. You may believe you are questioning authority, but if your questions fall within pre-approved frameworks, you are still inside the cage. Even rebellion is often scripted. What you consider transgressive is likely a version of resistance that has been normalized, absorbed, and commodified by the very structures it claims to oppose. Capitalism, for instance, thrives on innovation and disruption as long as those disruptions remain within marketable bounds. To be a revolutionary thinker today often means adopting a slightly edgier version of a mainstream ideology. The system allows room for critique, as long as that critique never leads to genuine subversion. Social media has intensified the illusion. The algorithms tailor your feed to reinforce your preferences, creating echo chambers where the same ideas circle endlessly. You are rewarded not for thinking differently, but for conforming in slightly novel ways. Virality becomes the measure of value, and critical thought gives way to performance. Even the desire to think for yourself, becomes part of a brand-own, more identity consumed and sold back to you. Friedrich Nietzsche warned against this long before the digital age. He saw most people as herd animals, thinking only in the ways that preserve their social standing or emotional security. True thinking, for Nietzsche, was dangerous. It meant breaking with consensus, facing the abyss, and risking alienation. Most avoid this path, not out of laziness, but out of fear. The cage is not just external, it is internalized. To think freely would mean dismantling not just the ideas you reject, but the assumptions you never thought to question. It would mean recognizing the invisible hands that have shaped your every conclusion. Until then, freedom of thought remains a comforting myth. You are not free, you are conditioned. And the most insidious part of the cage is that you can no longer see the bars. Forgiveness is often disguised superiority. Forgiveness is widely regarded as one of the highest moral axon expression of maturity, compassion, and emotional strength. But beneath its surface lies a more complex and often darker function. Forgiveness is not always a gesture of reconciliation. It can be a form of control. It places the forgiver in a morally superior position, above the one who is forgiven. It establishes a hierarchy of virtue, where one party possesses the power to absolve and the other is cast as the penitent. In this light, forgiveness is not always humble, it is often a subtle form of domination. To forgive someone is to declare that they have done wrong, and that you have chosen to release them from the moral debt they owe you. But this act is not neutral. It affirms your role as the injured party and reinforces their role as the transgressor. The act of forgiveness can become a public performance of righteousness. It says, "Look how noble I am, that I can rise above your offense." Even when done privately, forgiveness creates an unspoken imbalance. The forgiven is placed in a position of obligation, of lingering guilt, while the forgiver becomes the magnanimous judge. Friedrich Nietzsche would see this dynamic as a disguised expression of the will to power. Forgiveness, far from being selfless, is often a way to exert moral authority without appearing coercive. It enables the forgiver to maintain the upper hand, to control the narrative, and to define the moral terrain of the relationship. In this way, forgiveness doesn't always resolve conflict, it cements roles. One becomes the redeemer, the other, the redeemed. This is especially clear in cases where forgiveness is offered without request. When someone forgives another who is not asked to be forgiven, it can function as a moral ambush. The forgiven may feel confused, even resentful, because they are being cast in a role they did not agree to. They may not feel guiltier, may not have seen their action as wrong, but the act of unsolicited forgiveness forces them into the position of the morally inferior. Religions have institutionalized this imbalance. Divine forgiveness presupposes sin. You must accept your guilt before you can receive absolution. This creates an enduring dependency on the forgiving figure, whether it be God, priest, or Savior. The forgiven is never equal, they are perpetually grateful, perpetually indebted. In many interpersonal relationships, the same dynamic plays out. Forgiveness becomes a means of control disguised as grace. Even therapeutic culture promotes forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for the benefit of the forgiver. Forgive to heal, the saying goes. But this transforms forgiveness into a self-serving psychological hygiene exercise cloaked in virtue. The other person becomes irrelevant. The act is not about understanding or growth, it is about personal peace achieved through moral one-upmanship. Forgiveness is not inherently false or manipulative. It can be genuine, difficult, and transformative. But when it is wielded without reflection, it becomes a tool of superiority. The forgiver claims the high ground, often unchallenged, and the forgiven remains below, morally smaller. What appears as mercy may, in truth, be a display of dominance, dressed in virtue. The masses fear the truth more than they fear death. Truth is often celebrated in public discourse as a universal good, liberating, empowering, and morally urgent. But this romantic notion conceals a harsher, psychological reality. Most people fear truth far more than they fear death. Death is final, familiar, ritualized. Truth, by contrast, is destabilizing. It threatens identity, shatters illusions, and renders the world unfamiliar. While death ends life, truth disrupts it. And for many, that disruption is worse. The truths people fear most are not factual, they are existential. The truth about meaninglessness, the truth about personal mediocrity, the truth about social conditioning, the truth about the lies we live and tell, these are not truths that comfort, they are truths that demand transformation or despair. Most are not willing to pay the psychological cost of transformation, so they avoid the truth. They mask it with ideology, religion, distraction, and noise. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this fear clearly. He knew that most people cannot bear a godless, indifferent universe. The idea that life has no intrinsic meaning is too much for the average person to face. So they invent moral systems, metaphysical explanations, or utopian fantasies to keep the void at bay. These fictions offer coherence and comfort. The truth does not. The truth demands that you stand alone, without guarantees, and most would rather die than do that. Michel Foucault showed how truth is regulated by power. Institutions decide what is allowed to be true and what must be suppressed. But these institutions do not only enforce truths from above, they respond to the unconscious fears of the masses. People do not simply obey official lies, they cling to them. They want curated versions of reality that protect their self-image and social roles. They fear the chaos that truth would unleash. Social media, education, and entertainment all cater to this fear. They provide safe, truths palatable, simplified, affirming, complex, uncomfortable truths are filtered out. Conspiracy theories often arise not because people want to know more, but because they need to believe something else. The true horror is not that someone is lying to us. It is that no one is in control, and that the reality we live in is more random, cruel, and meaningless than we want to admit. Truth is lonely. It isolates. To believe something deeply unpopular, even if it's demonstrably true, comes with social cost. You lose friends, status, identity. For most people, death is a more acceptable price than social exile. They will die for beliefs they never examined, rather than live in a reality they can't control. The masses don't want the truth, they want reassurance. They want continuity. They want the world to make sense, even if that sense is a lie. The truth is too sharp, too bright, too demanding. It kills comfort. It exposes hypocrisy. It unmasks the masks. And for that, it is feared more than death itself. Because while death ends life, truth forces you to live without illusions, and that, for many, is unbearable. You are taught to worship your chains. The most effective form of control is not overt coercion, but internalized submission. People are not merely forced into subjugation, they are conditioned to love it. The systems that confine them are framed as sources of identity, pride, and safety. From an early age, individuals are taught not only to obey, but to revere the very structures that limit their autonomy. Chains are not presented as burdens, but as badges of belonging. Obedience is reframed as virtue, and dependency becomes a source of comfort. This is the genius of ideological conditioning. Education teaches children to sit still, obey authority, and memorize state-approved history, not to think critically, but to conform efficiently. These systems do not just instruct, they habituate. They turn behaviors into reflexes. By the time adulthood arrives, most people no longer question the norms they inherited. They work jobs they hate, follow rituals they don't understand, and vote in systems they barely believe in, yet they defend them passionately. Their chains are polished, and they wear them proudly. Michel Foucault argued that modern power operates through normalization. It doesn't punish through spectacle-like disciplines quietly, shaping individuals to regulate themselves. Surveillance becomes self-surveillance. External coercion is replaced by internal guilt. You are made to believe that your constraints are your choices. You choose the career, that drains you. You choose the relationships that conform to expectations. But that choice was molded long before it appeared. Friedrich Nietzsche would describe this as slave morality. The weak, having no power to escape their condition, sanctify it. They moralize submission, calling it humility. They praise obedience, calling it virtue. And eventually, they forget that anything else was ever possible. The highest values are those that keep them small. They are taught to see rebellion as arrogance, questioning as danger, and freedom as selfishness. Religious systems have perfected this dynamic. Suffering is framed as sacred, poverty as purity, doubt as sin. The chains of guilt and fear are called salvation. The believer is told they are free, even as they are forbidden to ask the most basic questions about their doctrine. Any discomfort is redirected inward. You must pray harder, surrender more. Liberation is promised in the afterlife. Submission is demanded now. Capitalism offers a secular version. You are told to love your job, your productivity, your hustle. Your self-worth is measured in number salaries, followers, engagement. Exhaustion is glorified. Scarcity is normalized. And when you break under the pressure, you are sold therapy, medication, or mindfulness apps that help you better tolerate your chains. The system teaches you to see your restraints as your identity. To question them feels like self-betrayal. So you rationalize. You celebrate small freedoms while ignoring large imprisonments. You defend the system that exploits you because your sense of self is built within it. The chains don't just bind your body, they shape your mind. Freedom requires not only breaking the chains, but recognizing that you were taught to love them. It is not rebellion that's unnatural, it's obedience without question. Most beliefs are rituals and self-deception. Beliefs are not always the outcome of careful reasoning. More often, they are psychological necessities, constructs we build to avoid pain, manage fear, or preserve identity. We believe not because something is true, but because it serves us to believe it. Beliefs become rituals, repeated affirmations that protect us from truths we cannot or will not face. In this way, belief is less about the external world and more about internal equilibrium. It is not truth-seeking, it is self-soothing. Most people adopt their beliefs long before they understand them. A child raised in a religious household learns to recite doctrine not through evidence but repetition. By the time they are capable of asking questions, the belief has already fused with their identity. To doubt it feels like self-annihilation. So rather than investigate, they rationalize. They surround the belief with rituals, prayer, phrases, behaviors that reinforce it. These rituals do not prove the belief, they protect it. Michel Foucault would argue that belief systems are structured by discourse and power. What people believe is often shaped by the institutions they are. Embedded in schools, churches, governments, media, these systems don't just provide information, they provide frameworks for interpreting it. Within those frameworks, some questions are encouraged, others silenced. Dissent is pathologized. Compliance is rewarded. The result is that people mistake conditioned agreement for personal insight. Friedrich Nietzsche exposed the emotional function of belief. He saw morality, religion, and even rationalism as disguises for deeper drives: envy, fear, resentment, the will to power. People adopt beliefs not because they are true, but because they help them justify their emotions or position. The poor may believe that wealth is corrupt because it helps them cope with deprivation. The pious may believe in hell because it satisfies a desire for justice. Belief becomes a narrative that flatters, protects, or explains one's suffering. Beliefs also serve a social function. They signal group membership. To hold the right beliefs is to be seen as sane, moral, and trustworthy. This creates enormous pressure to conform, even when doubt arises. Rather than risk exile, individuals deepen their commitment. They repeat mantras, defend contradictions, and attack dissenters not out of malice, but out of fear. The ritual must go on. In the age of social media, belief becomes branding. People perform their beliefs through posts, hashtags, and outrage. This is not about truth, it's about maintaining identity in a chaotic digital landscape. Algorithms reward repetition, not reflection. The more one repeats a belief, the more they are affirmed. The echo chamber becomes a temple. The ritual intensifies. This does not mean all belief is false, but it does mean most belief is unexamined. It is a psychological costume tailored for comfort. People don't cling to ideas because they are true, they cling because they are familiar. Belief becomes a way of staying asleep while pretending to be awake. And unless one has the courage to unlearn their rituals, they remain imprisoned, not by facts, but by the illusions they need to survive. Progress is a myth told by the dominant class. Progress is one of the most powerful and seductive narratives in human history. It tells a story of linear advancement of society moving from darkness to light, ignorance to knowledge, barbarism to civilization. But this story is rarely neutral. It is authored, maintained, and weaponized by those who benefit from the status quo. The idea of progress functions not as a historical fact, but as a mytho-legitimizing framework that justifies inequality, exploitation, and control. It reassures the winners that they are righteous and convinces the losers that suffering is a stepping stone. The myth of progress is most evident in the way history is taught. Wars are framed as necessary sacrifices. Colonialism becomes civilizing mission. Industrial exploitation becomes the price of innovation. Slavery, genocide, and environmental destruction are reduced to unfortunate but necessary phases. The dominant class writes the narrative of progress in such a way that their rise appears inevitable, even moral. They turn historical contingency into destiny. Michel Foucault would argue that what counts as progress is decided by systems of knowledge and power. The dominant discourse defines what is considered forward movement and what is considered regression. The Enlightenment, often cited as a triumph of reason, was also the age of race, science, empire, and state control. The technological era, praised for innovation, has coincided with surveillance, social fragmentation, and ecological collapse. Yet each stage is framed as a march toward something better. Progress also obscures who benefits. When a new technology is developed, it is declared progressive if it displaces workers, deepens inequality, or enables new forms of control. When social reforms occur, they are hailed as steps forward even if they are cosmetic, co-opted, or used to pacify unrest. The ruling class uses the language of progress to rebrand stability as improvement. Reform becomes a substitute for revolution. The system evolves just enough to preserve itself. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that belief in progress could become a secular religion and unquestioned faith in the future. This faith numbs people to present suffering. It tells them that things are getting better, even when their lives say otherwise. It encourages passivity. Why resist if the arc of history bends toward justice on its own? Progress becomes an anesthetic, a tranquilizer, handed out by those in power to keep the masses docile. The myth is also psychological. People want to believe that their struggles are part of a larger narrative, that the pain they endure has purpose. Progress provides that purpose. It turns trauma into fuel, failure into stepping stones. But this narrative often serves those who cause the pain. It reinterprets wounds as necessary, while absolving the wounders. Progress is not false in every case, but when treated as a given, it becomes dangerous. It hides power behind optimism. It turns critique into ingratitude. It replaces justice with patience. And it ensures that those who benefit from the current order remain the authors of the next chapter. The story goes on not because it is true, but because it is useful. Those who speak of peace are often preparing for war. The language of peace is rarely innocent. It is frequently employed not to prevent violence, but to justify it, not to disarm, but to mobilize. The most forceful advocates of peace are often those preparing for conflict, not out of contradiction, but out of strategy. The invocation of peace functions as a rhetorical shield masking aggression, justifying intervention, and moralizing violence before it begins. Peace becomes not a state of being, but a brandone that conceals motives rooted in power, fear, and domination. States, in particular, have mastered this rhetorical trick. Military invasions are framed as peacekeeping operations. Bombings are labeled surgical strikes for stability. Occupations are rebranded as humanitarian efforts. The aggressor never claims to start a war. They claim to restore order, to defend democracy, to prevent terror. By positioning themselves as guardians of peace, they frame any resistance as hostility. The enemy is not just wrong, they are anti-peace, and thus, war becomes a moral imperative. Michel Foucault would note how discourses are crafted by institutions to legitimize authority. Peace is one such discourse, often defined in ways that justify the existing order. Peace means the absence of threat, not necessarily the presence of justice. A society can be profoundly violent, economically, psychologically, structurally, and still be called peaceful if the violence is invisible or normalized. In such contexts, peace is the silence of the oppressed, not the harmony of equals. The individual, too, can manipulate the language of peace. People invoke it to shut down disagreement. Let's not argue. Let's just have peace. We need unity right now. These appeals are often used not to resolve conflict, but to suppress dissent. Peace becomes a weapon wielded against disruption. It is less about resolution and more about control. Philosophically, this aligns with Nietzsche's view of morality as a tool of the weak to constrain the strong. The call for peace is not always the voice of compassion. It can be the voice of fear, the desire to maintain a fragile status quo, to avoid confrontation, to preserve power structures under the guise of civility. Those who prepare for war often speak of peace the loudest because they understand the power of narrative. They must appear reluctant, regretful, even noble. Their violence must be framed not as desire, but as duty. History is full of examples. Before launching invasions, leaders issue statements of reluctant necessity. Before deploying troops, they speak of last resorts. Peace is held up like a talisman as if to ward off the accusation of aggression. Yet the movements of armies, the accumulation of weapons, and the tightening of propaganda all speak to preparation, not avoidance. Those who truly seek peace rarely need to say it. Their actions speak for them. But those who speak of peace loudly and often are typically laying the groundwork for justification, for retaliation, for dominance. They are not avoiding war, they are branding it. Being good is often a strategy to avoid punishment. Moral behavior is frequently praised as a sign of virtue, empathy, and character. But beneath many acts of goodness lies something less noble: the fear of punishment. From childhood to adulthood, much of what is labeled as morality is actually self-preservation. People do not always act well because they want to. They act well because they fear the consequences of acting otherwise. The appearance of goodness becomes a survival tactic, not an ethical commitment. This conditioning begins early. Children are rewarded for obedience and punished for defiance. They learn to associate being good with external approval. Goodness becomes synonymous with avoiding pain or gaining praise. The internalization of this pattern persists into adulthood. Laws, social norms, religious doctrines all reinforce the equation: do good, avoid punishment; do bad, suffer. The moral action is less about internal conviction and more about compliance under pressure. Michel Foucault explored how disciplinary societies use institutions to shape individuals into docile, predictable subjects. Schools, prisons, workplaces, and even families condition people to regulate themselves. Surveillance, both real and imagined, makes people police their own behavior. The goal is not moral transformation, it is functional obedience. In such a system, being good is not about ethics, it's about efficiency, conformity, and avoiding sanction. Religious morality often amplifies this effect. The threat of eternal damnation or divine punishment ensures compliance with prescribed behaviors. Believers may refrain from sin not out of love for the divine, but fear of consequence. The same dynamic appears in secular ideologies: reputational damage, social ostracism, cancellation. Modern virtue is frequently performative a display calibrated to maintain one's place in the tribe. People adopt ethical postures that signal alignment, but those postures are often hollow. They say the right things, share the right content, vote the right way not because they believe, but because deviation is dangerous. Friedrich Nietzsche would call this slave morality the morality of those who have learned to survive by submitting. Being good becomes a calculated maneuver. It is not a flourishing of spirit, but a survival instinct cloaked in righteousness. The good person may in fact be deeply resentful, craving power, but lacking the courage to claim it. Their morality becomes a disguise for cowardice. They follow the rules not because they value them, but because they lack the strength to challenge them. This doesn't make all goodness fraudulent, but it forces us to question its origin. When someone behaves morally, ask, would they still do so if there were no consequences? No praise, no punishment, no witness? If the answer is no, then their goodness is not ethical, it is strategic. The deeper question is not whether people act well, but why. True morality emerges not from fear, but from freedom. It is a commitment made in the absence of threat. Until then, much of what we call goodness is simply the careful choreography of those trying not to fall. We mask our cruelty in rituals of civility. Civilization prides itself on its manners. Politeness, etiquette, protocol, these are the hallmarks of a refined society. But beneath this surface of civility lies a darker truth. Cruelty is not eliminated by refinement, it is disguised. The rituals of social interaction often serve to mask domination, exclusion, and psychological violence. The handshake covers rivalry. The polite smile hides contempt. The carefully worded email delivers veiled threats. Civility becomes the stage on which cruelty is performed without consequence. In modern life, brutality rarely arrives with open hostility. It comes dressed in professionalism. A worker is fired with a smile and a scripted HR apology. A person is publicly humiliated in a passive-aggressive remark masked as feedback. A child is shamed through discipline, not abuse. The words are sanitized, the tone moderated, but the wound remains. In this way, cruelty is not removed from social life. It is embedded within it. It operates through rituals that make it acceptable. Michel Foucault emphasized how power is exercised not through violence alone, but through subtle mechanisms of control. The courtroom, the hospital, the school, these institutions do not scream. They do not beat. But they punish, they classify, they silence. The cruelty is bureaucratic, rationalized, impersonal. The person being crushed has no one to strike back against because the system delivers its pain through procedure, not passion. Friedrich Nietzsche would call this a form of moral hypocrisy. Those who claim to be civilized often engage in acts of cruelty they themselves would condemn if done openly. They insult with diplomacy. They punish with process. They destroy reputations with courtesy. Their cruelty is cold, not because they are above violence, but because they have learned to outsource it to structures, to customs, to norms. The cruelty of the civilized is efficient, deniable, and clean. This is especially visible in social hierarchies. The powerful do not need to shout, they need only imply. The boss does not need to scream, they can simply delay a promotion. The elite do not need to exile, they just withhold access. The rituals of civility allow cruelty to move through society like a ghost, present everywhere, visible nowhere. The victim is made to feel the cut, but the blade is invisible. Even in personal relationships, civility can serve as a smokescreen. People hurt each other nicely. They betray with kind words. They manipulate through politeness. A breakup becomes what's best for both of us. A lie becomes protecting your feelings, and abandonment is framed as self-care. the language of civility, turns cruelty into virtue. This does not mean civility is worthless. But when it becomes a shield for harm, it is no longer moral, it is cowardly. True ethics requires honesty, not performance. Until we are willing to confront the ways we use manners to hide malice, we will continue to smile while we destroy, and applaud ourselves for doing it gracefully. Even love has its tyrannies. Love is idealized as the purest human emotion, a sanctuary from the brutality of the world, a force that transcends power, ego, and control. But love, especially when institutionalized or possessive, often becomes its own form of tyranny. It demands obedience, loyalty, sacrifice, and conformity. It imposes expectations, polices freedom, and punishes deviation. What begins as mutual affection can morph into subtle domination, where the language of care becomes the logic of control. Romantic relationships, in particular, often operate on unspoken contracts. If you love me, you will. Becomes the beginning of emotional coercion. Love becomes a tool not for understanding the other, but for bending them. Sacrifices are demanded in the name of devotion. Personal boundaries are dissolved under the weight of shared lives. One partner becomes responsible for the other's emotional well-being. Autonomy is slowly traded for security. And because it's all done in the name of love, it's rarely questioned. Michel Foucault would see this as a classic example of soft power that doesn't oppress through force but through care. Love disciplines behavior, not with punishment, but with expectation. You don't say what you really think because it might hurt the one you love. You don't act on certain impulses because it could damage the relationship. Surveillance becomes internal. You police yourself not because you're afraid of being wrong, but because you're afraid of being unloved. In parent-child dynamics, the tyranny of love is even more pronounced. Parents often frame their control as protection. I do this because I love you. But love becomes the justification for domination. Children are shaped, restrained, and guided not toward freedom, but toward conformity, toward the version of life the parent deems acceptable. The child must become a projection of the parent's love, not a realization of their own potential. Dissent is seen as ingratitude, independence as betrayal. Friedrich Nietzsche warned that what we call virtue often masks will to power. Love is no exception. The lover may appear selfless, but beneath the surface lies a desire to possess, to define, to merge so completely with the other that their separateness disappears. In this form, love does not liberate, consumes. It ceases to be about two individuals and becomes about ownership of attention, affection, and time. The lover becomes both jailer and prisoner. Even social love of country, love of community, can devolve into tyranny. Patriotism demands allegiance. Community love demands assimilation. You are expected to love your nation uncritically, to sacrifice for your tribe, to conform to the values of your people. Failure to do so is punished with exclusion, suspicion, or accusation of betrayal. Love becomes a moral litmus test. To question is to betray. To dissent is to prove you never really loved in the first place. This is not to say love must be avoided, but to recognize that love, like all human phenomena, is susceptible to distortion. When love becomes conditional, coercive, or possessive, it ceases to nurture and begins to rule. And the tragedy is that because it wears the mask of affection, its tyranny often goes unnoticed until the freedom it erodes is already gone. Success is often the reward for conformity, not brilliance. The prevailing myth is that success is earned through talent, originality, and hard work. We are told that those who rise to the top do so because they have something exceptional to offer. But in reality, success is more often the result of conformity, of fitting into established systems, adopting dominant values, and performing in ways that are palatable to those in power. Brilliance, if not shaped to meet institutional expectations, is often ignored, suppressed, or punished. Systems reward obedience, not genius. Educational systems are the earliest factories of this dynamic. Students are rewarded not for creative insight, but for regurgitating approved material in the approved format. Critical thinking is praised only when it operates within safe boundaries. Those who challenge curriculum, question grading systems, or express unconventional views are seen as disruptive, not gifted. Brilliance becomes a liability unless it can be disciplined, categorized, and commodified. The corporate world operates no differently. Promotions and praise often go to those who play the game, those who learn the unspoken rules, adopt the right jargon, attend the right meetings, flatter the right people. Innovation is welcome only when it aligns with corporate goals. Dissent, even when rooted in truth, is treated as disloyalty. The employee who questions the status quo threatens the brand, the team, or the bottom line. It's safer to reward the reliable worker who nods at the right times than the visionary who questions everything. Michel Foucault would argue that this preference for conformity is a feature of disciplinary societies. Power operates through normalization, defining what behaviors, thoughts, and outcomes are acceptable. The successful person is not necessarily the smartest, they are the most well-adapted to the prevailing system. Their brilliance lies not in original thought, but in their ability to reflect the values of the dominant discourse. They succeed because they play the role the system needs them to play. Friedrich Nietzsche would take this further. He saw society as inherently hostile to the truly exceptional. The herd does not celebrate the genius it fears and resents them. The brilliant person threatens the shared illusion that everyone is equal in capacity. Rather than elevate such individuals, society often ridicules or marginalizes them unless they conform. Only when genius puts on a mask of normalcy can it be tolerated. The moment it exposes the mediocrity of the norm, it is silenced. Success stories are often sanitized. They are rewritten to emphasize persistence and positivity while erasing compromise and conformity. The reality is that many successful people were not the best but the safest, the most politically savvy, the least threatening. True brilliance often remains in the margins, unseen and uncelebrated, precisely because it will not bow to the rules. The system doesn't reward those who think differently. It rewards those who think differently in ways that reinforce its own structure. Success, as commonly defined, is not the triumph of brilliance, it is the triumph of adaptation, and those who confuse conformity with merit will continue to elevate mediocrity dressed in ambition while brilliance waits outside the gates. Your soul is a construct of your social environment. The soul is often imagined as a timeless, immutable essence, divine or internal truth, that defines who you are beneath all masks and roles. But this romantic notion does not hold up under scrutiny. What we call the soul, our deepest identity, our values, our sense of self is not discovered in isolation. It is built, piece by piece, by the environment in which we live. From the language we speak to the gods we worship, from the way we love to the way we grieve, our inner world is a reflection of the outer structures that shaped us. Michel Foucault's theory of subjectivity illustrates this clearly. The self is not an autonomous being hidden behind layers of socialization. It is a product of discourse, power, and history. Institutions shape not just behavior, but the categories of being. You are not simply a man, woman, citizen, or child. You are made into those things through schooling, religion, media, and law. The soul, then, is not a hidden truth, it is the residue of exposure to specific systems. Language is a powerful builder of the soul. You cannot think thoughts for which you lack words. Your emotional vocabulary is shaped by the culture that taught you how to name your pain, your joy, your fear. A person raised in a stoic environment may experience grief differently than someone in a culture of emotional openness. Even introspection is not free from social influence. The questions you ask yourself, the judgments you pass on your own desire soul, are echoes of voices you've absorbed. Friedrich Nietzsche would argue that morality, too, is imposed rather than chosen. The guilt you feel, the pride you cultivate, The virtues you aspire to all reflect the values of the herd, the tribe, the era. You are taught what to love and what to loathe. What you call your conscience may simply be internalized surveillance, a voice constructed from fear, praise, and punishment. The soul becomes a moral performance crafted to match the standards of your culture. Social roles reinforce this construction. Your identity as a kind person, a hard worker, a rebel, or a caretaker exists only in relation to others. You adopt and refine these identities based on feedback, rewards for conformity, punishment for deviation. Over time, these roles harden into personality. You come to believe that your true self is the sum of roles that were strategically adopted. But take away the environment that shaped them, and that self becomes unrecognizable. Even spiritual identity is socially coded. The metaphors you use to describe your soul, the wounded child, the divine light, the eternal wanderer, are cultural artifacts. They come from literature, sermons, songs, and stories you did not write. The soul is not discovered in silence. It is spoken into you. To believe in an untouched, pure soul is to ignore the complex architecture of influence that shaped it. What you are inside is not immune to what exists outside. Your essence is not timeless, it is time-stamped. The soul is not a refuge from the world, it is a product of it. People will kill for illusions before they die for truth. Human beings are not rational truth-seekers, they are emotional truth-makers. Most do not desire raw, unfiltered reality. They crave meaning, stability, identity. And when those needs are satisfied by illusion, they will defend those illusions with ferocity. People are more willing to kill to protect comforting falsehoods than they are to die for an inconvenient truth. Illusions offer certainty. Truth often brings chaos. One soothes the ego, the other dismantles it. History is filled with atrocities committed in defense of illusions. Wars are waged over borders drawn by myths, flags that symbolize invented glory, gods that promise salvation but demand obedience. The Crusades, the Inquisition, the genocides of the 20th century, none of these were motivated by a pure pursuit of truth. They were acts of devotion to narratives. The perpetrators believed or pretended to believe that their violence served a higher cause. But what they truly served was the illusion of righteousness, superiority, destiny. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this impulse deeply. He argued that humans do not seek truth because truth is often unbearable. Instead, they cling to illusions that justify their suffering, elevate their group, and sanctify their instincts. Religion, morality, ideology, these are not reflections of eternal truth, but constructs designed to make life tolerable. When those constructs are challenged, people do not calmly reevaluate. They lash out. The more fragile the belief, the more violently it is defended. Michel Foucault would frame this in terms of power. Truth is not a universal constant, it is shaped by institutions, language, and history. What a society accepts as true is often what its most powerful actors need to be accepted. But once institutionalized, these truths function as reality. And anyone who threatens them becomes an enemy not because they are incorrect, but because they threaten order. Illusions are embedded into systems that control education, media, religion, and law. To challenge them is to threaten the structure itself. Even on an individual level, people construct personal myths about their past, their worth, their purpose. These illusions are often essential for psychological survival. The person who believes they are inherently good will resist any evidence to the contrary. They will rewrite memories, reject feedback, and attack critics. Truth in this context is not liberating, it is annihilating. So they protect the illusion even at the cost of integrity, relationships, or reason. People rarely die for truth because truth is too uncertain. It does not guarantee reward. It does not offer emotional validation. It demands sacrifice without assurance. Illusions, by contrast, provide clarity. They split the world into good and evil, us and them, right and wrong. They give the illusion of control. And control, however fake, feels safer than the truth that everything is contingent, unstable, and subject to decay. The great danger of illusions is not that they are falsight, is that they are beloved. People will sacrifice others, destroy communities, and plunge into war to preserve the illusions that give their life meaning. The truth, if it comes at all, arrives too late after the blood has dried and the myth has hardened into memory. Civilization is the cage we built for our instincts. Civilization is praised as the triumph of reason over savageria, great upward march from chaos to order. But beneath its polished surface, civilization is not a liberation from instinct, it is its containment. It is the carefully constructed cage we built to tame the wildness within us. Law, morality, etiquette, architecture, religion all are fences around the primal. They are not solutions to human nature. They are strategies to suppress it. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this suppression as the source of both suffering and creativity. Civilization forces individuals to turn their instincts inward. Rage, lust, ambition must be repressed, redirected, or masked. The result is guilt, neurosis, and existential unrest. But it is also the source of culture. What we cannot express through instinct, we express through art, ritual, and philosophy. The caged animal dreams. The domesticated human builds cathedrals and writes tragedies. Michel Foucault examined how institutions discipline bodies and minds to produce predictable behavior. Schools regulate energy, prisons regulate deviation, hospitals regulate emotion. These systems do not eliminate the instinctual, they control it through repetition, surveillance, and internalized norms. The person who appears calm and civilized may not be free of aggression or desire, they have simply learned how to bury it beneath protocol. Civilization trains us to fear instinct. The child who expresses anger is sent to their room. The adult who shows too much desire is shamed or pathologized. Spontaneity becomes immaturity. Expression becomes excess. The self is molded to fit systems of productivity, obedience, and social order. Civilization replaces impulse with scheduling, ritual, and approval-seeking. The primal is not erased, it is ritualized. Violence becomes war, desire becomes courtship, fear becomes faith. The illusion is that we have transcended our animality, but no amount of refinement can eliminate the biological drives at the core of human behavior. The urge to dominate, the hunger for sex, the fear of death, the craving for status, these still guide decisions, relationships, and institutions. We just learn how to code them in socially acceptable ways. Aggression becomes competition. Lust becomes branding. Envy becomes aspiration. This domestication creates conflict within the individual. You are taught to be polite when you want to scream, to forgive when you want revenge, to serve when you want to conquer. These internal contradictions do not vanish, they fester. The result is anxiety, depression, repression, and rage that leaks through cracks in the facade. The more civilized a society becomes, the more fragile it may be, because the tension between instinct and norm is stretched to its limits. Civilization is not inherently evil. It is a necessary structure, but it must be understood for what it is. Not an evolution beyond nature, but a cage around it. And the more we mistake the cage for progress, the less we understand the forces it was built to contain. The instinctual does not disappear. It waits beneath suits, beneath laws, beneath prayers. Civilization does not kill the beast. It teaches it how to smile. Victimhood can be a form of power. Victimhood is usually associated with weakness, trauma, and injustice. It elicits sympathy, moral support, and sometimes reparation. But in a society that rewards moral high ground, being a victim can also become a form of power. It grants authority in discourse, protection from criticism, and access to resource emotional, social, and even institutional. When victimhood becomes incentivized, it is no longer just a state of suffering, it becomes a strategy. In identity-based politics, the voice of the victim often carries the greatest moral weight. Those who have suffered are seen as possessing special insight, authenticity, and credibility. This dynamic, while initially rooted in justice, can be manipulated. Individuals or groups may emphasize their victimhood not just to seek justice, but to gain leverage, silencing opponents, demanding uncritical validation, and deflecting accountability. The role of the victim becomes a position of rhetorical superiority. Michel Foucault would describe this as a function of power relations disguised as morality. Inverting the traditional power hierarchy, the victim is no longer at the bottom, they are elevated through their suffering. Their pain becomes symbolic capital. They are less questioned, more praised, and often insulated from the same scrutiny others face. To criticize them becomes an act of perceived oppression, regardless of the content or context of that criticism. Friedrich Nietzsche warned against the cultural glorification of victimhood. He saw it as a symptom of ressentimento, deep, festering resentment that transforms weakness into a weapon. The weak, unable to act with power, reframe their suffering as moral superiority. They declare themselves virtuous because they endure. The strong are demonized not because they are unjust, but because they are strong. This reversal creates a moral economy where suffering becomes currency and victimhood, a tool of revenge. Social media has amplified this phenomenon. Online platforms reward narratives of pain with attention, likes, and virality. The more traumatic the story, the greater the reach. This creates a perverse incentive structure where victimhood is not merely expressed, it is curated. The boundaries between sharing for healing and sharing for power blur. Emotional exhibition becomes a method of gaining status in moral hierarchies. The performance of pain becomes its own genre. This does not negate the reality of suffering or the legitimacy of victims, but it does expose how quickly suffering can be politicized and weaponized. When victimhood becomes a permanent identity, it risks ossifying the individual, trapping them in their past, discouraging agency, and demanding loyalty to pain over growth. It also creates conflict between groups, each vying for moral superiority through comparative suffering. Justice is reduced to a competition of wounds. The moral authority of the victim must be respected but also interrogated. Power is not limited to wealth or weapons. It resides wherever people are shielded from accountability, able to command attention and control discourse. Victimhood, when converted into a permanent political identity, becomes one more tool in the arsenal of power, cloaked not in strength, but in the language of injury. People don't want freedom, they want predictability. Freedom is one of the most revered values in modern society. It is enshrined in constitutions, glorified in revolutions, and sold in advertising. But despite its cultural importance, most people do not actually desire true freedom. What they crave is predictability, the comfort of routine, the safety of expectations, the assurance that tomorrow will resemble today. Freedom, in its raw form, is terrifying. It implies responsibility, risk, uncertainty. Predictability, by contrast, offers order, control, and peace of mind. This preference begins early. From childhood, individuals are taught to follow routines, fixed schedules, standardized testing, behavioral norms. These structures are not designed to cultivate autonomy, they are designed to foster reliability. The child who thrives in school is not the freest, but the most predictable, the one who follows rules, completes tasks, and fits into the system. Freedom is romanticized in rhetoric, but in practice, it is quietly discouraged. Michel Foucault examined how institutions function to normalize behavior. Schools, prisons, hospitals, and bureaucracies do not promote individuality, they produce conformity. They regulate time, space, and conduct. People are not given freedom, they are given roles. Even leisure time is scheduled, commodified, and patterned. The illusion of freedom is maintained through consumer choice, but these choices are constrained by algorithms, economics, and social conditioning. True freedom, the ability to think and act beyond all conditioning, is so rare that it appears subversive. Friedrich Nietzsche would say that most people avoid freedom because it forces them to confront the chaos of existence. Freedom requires the creation of one's own values, the acceptance of isolation, and the courage to live without guarantees. It is not a passive state, it is an ongoing act of will. Most people, faced with this burden, retreat into systems of belief, tradition, or authority. They trade uncertainty for stability. They prefer to be told what to do, as long as they can pretend they are choosing. This is evident in political life. Voters often prefer predictable leaders, even if they are mediocre or corrupt, over radical thinkers who might destabilize the familiar. Predictability signals safety. Change, even if positive, threatens the known order. In relationships, people seek partners who reinforce their routines, not those who challenge their assumptions. Even rebellion becomes predictably an aesthetic of resistance that fits within culturally accepted boundaries. The marketplace thrives on this craving. Businesses profit by offering systems of predictability, subscription models, personalized content, on-demand everything. The consumer is free only to choose from a narrow menu designed to anticipate and control their preferences. Freedom is marketed, but predictability is delivered. When given the opportunity for real freedom, most people hesitate. They ask for maps, guarantees, definitions. They do not want to wander, they want a guided tour. They do not want the truth, they want a narrative. Freedom requires too much self-awareness, courage, detachment. Predictability, though limited, is easier. It feels like safety. But it is safety in a cage. The world doesn't care about your meaning. Meaning is a human invention, a narrative imposed on an indifferent universe. The stars do not align for your destiny. Nature does not orchestrate your struggles for a lesson. The world, in its raw form, does not care if your life makes sense. It does not care if your pain has purpose, if your efforts succeed, or if your death is remembered. This is not a statement of despair, it is a statement of reality, and understanding it is the first step toward mature freedom. People crave meaning not because it is real, but because it is necessary. The idea that life must mean something provides psychological structure. It turns suffering into sacrifice, chaos into destiny, and randomness into narrative. It protects the mind from the abyss of pointlessness. Religion, ideology, and even science, when misused, offer systems of meaning that promise coherence. They tell you that your existence matters in some grand design. But the universe, silent and vast, does not confirm this. Friedrich Nietzsche declared that God is dead, not to destroy hope, but to reveal the emptiness left when traditional sources of meaning collapse. Without God, meaning becomes a human task. But most people are not ready for this responsibility. They continue to act as if the world owes them significance, as if their suffering is unjust because it lacks a cosmic purpose. They mistake the absence of meaning as a failure rather than what it is, the neutral backdrop against which human creativity must act. Michel Foucault would argue that even the way we define meaning is shaped by power. Institutions tell you what is meaningful: career success, patriotism, academic validation, romantic fulfillment. These are not universal truths, they are cultural constructs. You are taught what to pursue and what to value. Meaning is not discovered, it is distributed, curated by systems that require people to believe in purpose, so they will comply with their roles. People project meaning into everything: signs, coincidences, tragedies, dreams. They search for messages where there are only events. They romanticize pain, so it feels justified. They moralize outcomes to feel in control. But none of this changes the fact that the universe operates without intention. Natural disasters are not punishments. Disease is not a test. Success is not a reward for virtue. This truth can feel unbearable, but it is also liberating. If the world does not assign your life meaning, then you are free to create it. You are not bound by inherited scripts. You do not have to wait for validation from the cosmos. You can live without apology, without justification, without illusion. The world will go on, with or without your story. The stars will not dim at your death. The sea will not pause for your grief. But in that indifference lies a rare kind of power, the freedom to define yourself without expectation, to live not because it matters, but because you choose to. You were born into a system designed to tame you. From the moment you entered the world, you were placed inside a structure built not to empower you, but to shape you, to make you manageable, predictable, and compliant. This system has many names: society, civilization, culture, education, government. It presents itself as a guide, a protector, a nurturer. But beneath that benevolent facade lies a function that is far more pragmatic: domestication. You are not raised to be wild. You are raised to be tamed. Taming begins with language. You are taught words not only to express, but to limit. You are told what things are and what they are not. Boundaries are drawn before you can question them. The language you speak becomes the cage for your thoughts. You do not name the world freely, you inherit its names, its definitions, its moral labels. And once you can speak their language, you begin to think their thoughts. Michel Foucault wrote about how institutions mold individuals into subjects. Schools do not simply educate, they discipline. They break the chaos of childhood into rows, bells, grades, and obedience. Hospitals normalize the body, prisons normalize punishment, bureaucracies normalize behavior. At every stage, the system does not destroy you, it organizes you. Your energy is redirected, your instincts managed, your creativity streamlined. You are taught how to sit, how to speak, how to succeed according to rules you never created. Friedrich Nietzsche saw the same pattern in morality. He believed that societal values, meekness, humility, obedience, were not virtues, but tools used by the weak to tame the strong. The wild instincts of ambition, passion, rebellion are reframed as sins. You are not punished for being dangerous. You are taught to punish yourself. Guilt becomes the leash. The inner voice that scolds you is not your conscience, it is your training. Even your desires are manufactured. You are told what to want, what to aspire to, what to fear. The system gives you a checklist: education, job, marriage, success. You pursue these not out of deep personal reflection, but because deviation means punishment, ostracism, failure, insignificance. The system offers choices, but all within a pre-approved menu. Rebellion is often just another form of conformity with new packaging. What is called freedom is usually a controlled zone of movement room to choose between Pepsi and Coke, not between dependence and sovereignty. The system does not need to oppress you with violence if it can shape your dreams, your goals, your very sense of what is possible. You were born wild, but you were tamed before you had a chance to howl. The system did not break you, domesticated you. It taught you to love your leash, to decorate your cage, to see your obedience as virtue. But somewhere inside, the untamed still stirs. And the question that remains is whether you will let it wake or let it sleep forever.